I would like to warmly welcome all of you to our second day of the fourth annual Women in Medicine and Science Professional Development Conference. I want to thank everybody for joining us yesterday and thank all of you who are here today with us. I think you're in for a real treat for another exhilarating, inspiring, and empowering session of phenomenal speakers. And speaking of sessions and speakers, what a powerful day yesterday. You know, I was reflecting on what each of the speakers taught me, and I start with Nikita Richards, who made me reflect on my own lifelong journey towards cultural humility and optimizing it. And I loved the audience participation system where all of you shared your thoughts. And I love the adage that it's okay to not know everything and that it's okay to admit when you're wrong. And that these are very much the features of a transformational leader, as Nikita Richards talked about, who really creates a vision and inspires change. I also reflected deeply on our panel discussion, expertly led by Dr. Stacy Satovia, and the pearls that I gleaned from that discussion were from Dr. Hingle, moving from the idea of work-life balance to work-life harmony, to it's okay to not be okay, and ask for help, which was mentioned by Ms. Heather Wetzel. The motto, if not me, then who, by one of our community champions and leaders, Ms. Erica Austin. And really embracing our vulnerability and coming to terms with imposter phenomenon, which if you're not familiar with that term, it's the idea that all of your accomplishments are as a result of either working harder than everyone else or simply luck, as opposed to innate talent. And that was something Ms. Tracy Smith shared. And Michael Fallon, Mr. Michael Fallon, talking about how if you see advocacy as a calling, not waiting, jumping in with the plan and getting a good team together. All of those things really resonated with me. It's especially Dr. Ann Thornton when she shared her story about how she stood up for herself as a child when the kids were calling her Sissy, and she declared, "My name is not Sissy." That really struck a chord with me. She and Nikita Richards both shared very personal stories, which really gave us their why they're advocates. And it makes me think about our stories. What are our advocacy stories? And sometimes these stories are painful, the journeys are painful, but therein lies the beauty. So as we delve deeper into our conference today, I want you to really consider, what is your advocacy story? What is your why? And even if it's painful, the pain and that vulnerability that you share is really powerful and will propel others into this important work. And that is my challenge for you today. Now, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Larissa Avila Santa. She is the Director of Clinical and Health Services Research at NIMHD, the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. In her current role, she works with the CHSR team on fostering research aimed at improving health outcomes of health disparities populations. This may be accomplished through research designed to understand most effective preventive and clinical care practices within healthcare settings, while also informing population health, health policy, and public policy experts. Prior to joining NIMHD, Dr. Avila Santa worked at the NHLBI as the project director for the Hispanic Community Health Study of Latinos. In addition, she has participated in multiple NIH-wide committees and working groups addressing minority health, diabetes and its complications, women's health, and vascular dementia. In 2015, she founded the NIH Hispanic Health Research Scientific Interest Group. In 2017, Dr. Avila Santa was the field coordinator of the post-disaster recovery of the health and social services of the entire country of Puerto Rico during the first 6.5 months of work, coordinated by the HHS ASPR Recovery Division, impacting 3.4 million human lives. Dr. Avila Santa earned her medical degree from the University of Puerto Rico School of Medicine and completed a residency in internal medicine at the University Hospital in San Juan and a fellowship in endocrinology at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. As a faculty member of the endocrine division at UT Southwestern, she worked in clinical research, teaching, and patient care. She also earned a master's degree at the UT School of Public Health. Dr. Avila Santa, it's our honor and privilege. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, the honor is mine, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I want to say hello to everyone who is watching and attending this fabulous conference. It is my delight to be here, and I'm quite honored. I am very excited about the things that I'm going to share with you, and I hope that they are going to resonate with your life and that are going to be useful as you think about research as a way to advocate for the truth and advocate for our patients and the well-being of our society. So the objectives of my presentation include describing advocacy from the perspective of minority health and health disparities, and specifically in the United States. I'm going to also discuss the role of biomedical research and researchers in advocacy and identify potential applications of the terms and the examples that I'm going to illustrate in real life. Now, there is a spoiler alert. I will talk about these principles and objectives, not necessarily in a sequential way, but in an organic way. I do have to disclaim that I don't have any conflicts of interest and that I'm going to share my opinions, and my opinions do not represent the National Institutes of Health where I work or the federal government. So in preparing for this invitation, I went back to the dictionary and I went back to several resources to really look for the term, the definition of advocacy. And other speakers have probably mentioned this before, but bear with me. So advocacy is a Latin term, and in Spanish and in other Roman languages, we use it quite often. And it resonates with the term avocat or avoca. Voca means voice, and voca means calling. So vocation, you're calling, but voca is also to give voice to something. And ad is to represent, to put the voice where it may not exist. And we use the term abogado as avocat, lawyer, because the original, perhaps, profession, it was to represent someone to a court, to a group of people that would determine a judgment or the results of a trial. Now, a pleader is someone who is invoking the law, the rights, and the well-being of someone else, and even an intercessor or champion. NCI, or the National Cancer Institute, provides a definition for research advocate, and is a person who serves as a link between patients and scientific researchers, and also understands what the patients go through in their life course in terms of disease, and understands the importance of research, but also the importance of patients when they are participating in research. Others have defined different types of advocacy, like community advocacy, health advocacy, and self-advocacy. And it all depends on the situation. It all depends on the context. Of course, health advocacy aims at bridging gaps between the healthcare system and the patients, communication, access to healthcare, quality healthcare, and self-advocacy in terms of healthcare is when it refers to the patient's behaviors and the patient giving voice to his or her desires, and role in healthcare or health research. Now, the American Nurses Association has a somewhat different definition, and I want to emphasize this part, that it is a plea, it is someone favoring or arguing or pleading for someone else, but it has an objective, and it's developing that person's, that community's, that system's voice, and let them act and speak on their behalf for themselves. And that in advocacy, we can use it to move forward, to plead, to resolve health disparities. So I further look for advocacy in the literature, and just doing a very rough literature search, I found more than 5,000 articles that somehow included advocacy in their terms or in their discourse. And as I kept doing a narrower search, and I added humans, and then I narrowed the time frame, I also found that advocacy and health disparities only yielded like 190 articles, and I did not do a systematic review of these articles. I wonder if they are truly 190, and there could be fewer than that. I also looked for terms like scientist advocate, health advocate, researcher advocate, and there were a variety of terms, but it didn't really lead me to, this is the area where advocacy is defined in research. So what I did find is a lack of consistency in terminology. And really one question, is advocacy really implicit or explicitly reported in scientific publications? Are we doing advocacy and not calling it that way? Then I looked at the research framework that NIMHD, my institute, has provided and has supported and really encourage investigators to think about, not only to resolve health disparities, but thinking about health in general, the health of the population. Traditionally, or for a long time, when we dedicated our research efforts for clinical research, clinical trials, research that involves the response to a treatment or the patient within a healthcare system, we used to think about the individual only, and the interventions were at the individual level, and still are at the individual level only. Medication and the patient, physician or clinician and the patient, the healthcare system and the patient. But we did not include or did not think of other factors that could affect those the outcomes, the health outcomes of the patient, the community, the population in general. And this framework is trying to convey those levels of influence and domains of influence that we need to really think about, and maybe moving more from more individual interventions to include other levels, because we can test the efficacy or the effectiveness of a treatment in its own in a very narrow, very clean, very restricted or controlled environment. But in real life, the health outcomes may be different because there are other factors that are influencing. Now, in looking at this research framework, I still pondered a few questions. Are researchers observers of what is happening on these interactions and mediations? Or are we members of the populations of interest? Are we part of that framework? Are we inside that framework? And is there a real distinction between advocating for patients, for populations, or a cause of interest, and advocating for research? I transformed that framework into what I attempted as a three-dimensional or multidimensional illustration on how these factors interact with each other, just for illustration purposes. The different domains may have an interaction or a manifestation or influence the manifestation of health and disease at different levels with different intensity across the life course. And at an age, some of the factors are more predominant. Later in life, other factors may show up, but the factors also could change over time. So this is the complexity in which each one of us lives. And we are not in a bubble. We live among people, and we live among resources, and we have surroundings that we influence and that influence us. And we also interact with other human beings and with structures and with frameworks. In addition to this, health also depends on other sectors, on other factors beyond healthcare or the healthcare system. Policies, environmental exposures, education, transportation, water, energy, all of that are going to influence how my healthcare system works. If we have electricity, if we have good transportation to go to the nearest hospital, if we have good roads, if we received a good education and we have a good educational attainment, if the justice and system is really fair and working, if my community has resources that go beyond the healthcare system and go beyond our immediate surroundings. So in all of this, we are part of it. And it's the message that I would like to really share with you, is that we are part of this population. We are also patients, and we are also advocates. In some instances, we are going to wear a hat of research and look at everything from the lens of, through the lens of research. Sometimes we are going to look at everything through the lens of a patient, sometimes through the lens of an advocate, or all of them could be combined. Now, the following are my thoughts, and maybe they are starting point for a conversation. So in looking at all the frameworks and the definitions that I have shared with you, I sort of describe the role of the health and or clinical researcher, which also can apply to clinicians, in advocacy as the following: as identifying gaps or needs in healthcare, in understanding mechanisms of disease, in understanding how medications, treatments work, in understanding how to best achieve the highest quality care for our patients, and searching for the best answers to imminent patients' populations' concerns. In giving voice to the best research or stimulating its own voice, in really aiming at the highest quality research, research that is well designed and that the studies are well analyzed, and that the implementation of those findings into clinical practice is effective, and that we don't forget it. Also, identifying or facilitating patients and populations' own voice, and through the research study design, incorporating the perspectives of the patients, the communities, how we can adapt methods and protocols to real life, but also as we perform research, how we collect, how we learn, from the patients, maybe through patient-reported outcomes, maybe through feedback. Informing policy. Research really can be powerful at demonstrating effectiveness or not, at demonstrating other research questions, at generating other hypotheses. But in that way, informing policy on things that could be changed and that could transform the health of the population and healthcare that they are receiving. And this is attained with high quality research and high quality data. And we know there are still some gaps in the type and the depth of the data that sometimes we try to collect from healthcare sources. And this is an ongoing transformation in which we need to participate. And communicating research findings well. And in that, we need to include patients, the media, policymakers, and other researchers. So I would like to share some examples on how research has been a vehicle of really illustrating the needs of the population and or how advocacy has been integrated and research is moving forward to really disclosing more and more information and at the same time additional questions that could be answered. And the first one, obviously, I put it on the screen, is Hispanic Latino health research. So and this is in the US. The Framingham Heart Study was initiated in 1948 with the purpose of understanding the mediators or the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, which at that time was the #1 cause of mortality in the US, or one of the top causes, the leading causes. After Framingham started publishing results on risk factors related to myocardial infarction and other cardiovascular endpoints, two major studies that were very similar to Framingham were initiated, and that in that season is one of the first studies that included or focused on a Hispanic group, and it was the Puerto Rico Heart Health Program that was initiated in 1965. After that, a few other studies in Texas, all focused in the population in that area who are mostly of Mexican descent, and focused also on cardiovascular disease. Then in the 1980s, there was a one-time study that followed the protocol of the NHANES that you have probably know and be acquainted with. And it was fully dedicated to perform the same assessments, but only in the Hispanic population in the US. And they recruited a representative sample of the three groups that were the most predominant, the three Hispanic groups that were most predominant at that time, that were Mexican, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban descent, participants of those origins. And while that was happening, I'm sorry, I did, okay. Dr. Marquez and a colleague published a review of the literature on the health of Hispanics in the Southwestern United States. And they use the term the epidemiologic paradox. Why? They, in their review, they uncovered that despite adversity, socioeconomic adversities, and what seemed to be a large number of health risk factors, this population, Hispanics of the Southwest, did have a similar or even lower mortality rate, than non-Hispanic whites, and the same for cardiovascular mortality. So considering the number of negative factors, they still seem to not have the similar mortality rate. So that was the paradox. When the study was published, then other scientists used the term the Hispanic paradox. And very quickly, it was assumed that what was published by Dr. Marquez and focused on the Hispanics in the Southwest United States applied to every Hispanic group across the US. So there was an assumption, but there wasn't really evidence that supported that. So it triggered more and more questions about the health of Hispanics. Then in 1993, the US Surgeon General, Dr. Antonia Novello, put together a working group that identified several items that needed to be addressed for Hispanic health. And one of them was to really foster very thorough and very in-depth research in the health of Hispanics. That was 1993. Things did not change very quickly in that regard in terms of research. And other studies continue developing, and they were regional. There were some other national studies that included Hispanics. And some of the regional studies were more focused on the Hispanic groups that lived in those regions. The national studies included them and included other populations. And there are other studies that happening in Boston, in New York, different age groups, different purposes. Then in 2006, the Hispanic Community Health Study of Latinos, was the first one that had the intent of recruiting participants from different Hispanic backgrounds that wanted to really understand the prevalence of specific chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, and also risk factors, but also identify what could be the protective factors of this population or populations that seem not to have the same degree of cardiovascular mortality as other populations in the US. And it also was the first study that was intended to be longitudinal. So there was a significant step forward to understanding Hispanic health through the Hispanic Community Health Study. And later on, additional regional studies in Puerto Rico, Prospect and Puerto Rico Outlook, have been recently funded by NIH that look at cardiovascular risk factors in both men and women in different age groups, and try to understand not only the traditional risk factors, but other and emerging risk factors like sleep apnea and others. But we still have a long way to understand Hispanic health and move also to more tailored and effective preventive and treatment interventions. Now we are in the era of precision medicine, and all of us has done a tremendous work at recruiting participants from underserved or underrepresented groups in research. And they have right now really recruited a very large number of Hispanics, Latinos, and we hope and we look forward to understand and learn what is discovered and the steps in the future. Now, I want to also show another aspect of research in Hispanic health, and as it was mentioned before, I created a group, a scientific interest group at the NIH dedicated to Hispanic health research. And this group, we put together our efforts and did a portfolio analysis of funded research that focused on Hispanic health over a period of over 10 years at the NIH. On the lower left hand on your screen, there is a graph showing the number of applications that are received annually by NIH and in all topics, and those that qualify as Hispanic health research. And this is specifically the grant applications that fall within the R programs, the research program grants like the R01s, R03s, R21s, etc. The message of this graph is that consistently in the blue line, the number of applications that are funded by the NIH, the percent is between 15–20% every year. Now, for Hispanic health-related research, the number of applications that are received are much, much fewer to start with. And the number of that, or the percent that are funded, are a little lower, but not dramatically lower than the overall percent for NIH. But the main message is the number of applications, or the percent, is very low across the portfolio, but the number that are really received is very low. So we have an opportunity to really foster and promote interest in Hispanic health because the opportunities are there, and there are gaps in research, and there are needs in the community that are certainly prime for us to really make a great contribution. And the last aspect that I wanted to share with you about this particular analysis is where these applications came from. And the map on your right shows the applications that we looked at more in depth. We focused on 6 disease areas, and I invite you to look for the paper. We evaluated diabetes, cancer, cognitive decline, liver and gallbladder disease, obesity, and asthma. And the applications came mostly from big institutions that have a long-term history doing research, not so much from Puerto Rico, and surprisingly, not many from the Southwest as compared to California and the Northeast. Also, the maps, the census shows that more or less in those areas, the concentration of Hispanics is the highest across the US. Nonetheless, the Hispanic population has been significantly increasing in those states that are paler or that have no grants. So here is also an opportunity to those institutions that are in the empty space to really put forward good applications and maybe collaborate with bigger institutions. But the populations that live in those areas may have different health characteristics, or may benefit from the knowledge that has been garnered from research done in other areas in the US. So to wrap up with this particular example, some of the opportunities to further expand and advocate for Hispanic Latino research include the longevity of Hispanic women. I mentioned before the Hispanic paradox, and the CDC, and they have published multiple trends in mortality for non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics, and African Americans. And Hispanics as a group have the longest life expectancy, and among Hispanics, Hispanic women. So in general, across the board, Hispanic women live the longest in the US. So what is making Hispanic women live longer? Why Hispanics in general as a group live longer than other populations? And what that really means? Do we live longer and healthier, or do we live longer and with chronic diseases? And how we cope with that? Is there resilience? What is it? The health and well-being of older adults is an area that needs attention, especially among Hispanic Latinos. And cancer and other chronic diseases. Cancer is the leading cause of death among Hispanics, not cardiovascular disease. And to understand other chronic diseases, mechanisms of disease prevention at the primary level, and prevention at the complication or when the disease is established, and effective treatments. The role of work in health disparities in the Hispanic population. The growing awareness of chronic diseases across the hemisphere, but the need for consistent epidemiological measurements, and the need for innovative interventions, including implementation of guidelines of care, and whether models of interventions at the country level, at the group level, community level, are feasible and sustainable. And definitely increasing the number of investigators interested in Hispanic health. Another example of the role of research and advocacy and how they are intertwined comes with maternal mortality and morbidity. And this illustration, I believe I took it from Illinois. This is a campaign on maternal mortality and morbidity. So I want to give credit to Illinois and the Department of Health for doing this. And one example of research that has been done in this area, it comes from Dr. Elizabeth Howell. She is funded by NIMHD. And she's one of the first to really demonstrate the relationship between maternal or delivery outcomes and the hospitals, the healthcare systems where women go and deliver. And she found or described some significant differences in the outcomes between Black women and white women according to the hospital's nursery level and delivery volume. I mean, the more practice, the more experienced the personnel and the hospital are to manage critical cases or complicated pregnancies and deliveries, well, the better outcomes are going to be documented. But it seems like women from different groups do not have access to the same high quality or more experienced hospitals, and that could influence their delivery outcomes. This particular article has more details, and she defines morbidity in a very in-depth analysis, and I invite you to look at it. The topic of maternal mortality and morbidity has resonated across the US, and in part because there are celebrities that are also giving a voice to the issue. And in addition to the research that has been done and has been elevated to the level of those who make the law and those who make the law and those who really have the power and authority to move things. So these are examples on the results of the hearings and the discussions on how to really focus on this topic, and has led in part to a funding opportunity announcement that we published last year on addressing racial disparities in maternal mortality and morbidity. It was a one-time funding opportunity announcement 6 awards were, or 6 grant applications were awarded. And we look forward to the results and how the investigators are advancing in their research projects. In addition, NIH-wide, there is the Improve initiative, and there have been some supplements, administrative supplements to collect more in-depth information and or do pilot studies to improve the health outcomes of women who are at the highest risk of mortality and or severe morbidity. Nonetheless, there are a few things, well, I shouldn't say a few, there are several things that are still not well described and that advocates could play a tremendous role in them. And they include postpartum care, prevention or management of chronic diseases. In other words, how long, what is the optimal continuity of care after delivery? It seems like there has been a standard acceptance that 6 weeks postpartum is a good checkup, but some of the postpartum complications may manifest beyond the 6 weeks. They could manifest even a year later. So there have been advocates within the research community, within the clinical community, that would like to explore and demonstrate that we need to expand that 6 week period and provide women with a more reasonable and just and high quality care. Peripartum depression is still a problem at the clinical level, but also at the documentation of it. How is it really screened, or do we screen all women? It seems like there are disparities in this area too, not only in terms of access to care, but in identifying whether these women are at risk or are having symptoms, or is there an intervention, a timely intervention that could be provided? Preconception, prevention of cardiometabolic disease, chronic diseases preceding pregnancy, the health of women from different racial, ethnic origins and social backgrounds, that because there may be smaller groups, maybe we are not collecting information or understanding how these issues are manifested or not, or maybe we can learn from protective factors from these groups. And definitely models of healthcare, especially in rural areas, and addressing health disparities for women before, during, and after pregnancy. Another area of advocacy, another area that has been discussed and is still discussed, and we need to do a better job, is at funding of African American investigators and other investigators from underrepresented minorities, underrepresented groups. And one of the triggers of this issue actually was a research project that Dr. Ginther and her group published in 2011, demonstrating that, if you see in the lower right hand, demonstrating that Black or African American investigators had a much lower R01 award probability than investigators from other groups. And in further, a more in-depth analysis broken by new investigator category or experienced investigator category, and comparing PhD and MDs, consistently, investigators from Black or African American background had a lower probability of being funded. And I want to also point out that they looked at both men and women, and in some of the categories, there were fewer women that had the probability of being funded. This article has other analysis, and Dr. Ginther has published other analysis on the same topic. But this one triggered further and very in-depth discussions at the NIH level and led to some analysis, in-house analysis. And this one, the topic choice, confirmed that African American or Black applicants had a significantly lower percent chance of being funded. And this is focused on R01s as well. And in here on the lower left, what is also outstanding is that even at very good impact scores, when the peer review happens, African Americans get funded at the lower rate. And so this promoted more internal discussions on what is happening. Is it reviewers' bias? Is it the methods? Is it the critiques? What is happening? I invite you to also read this article because the researchers or the NIH staff who performed this analysis, they reached some conclusions about the topic that the investigators chose to do the work on may have influenced these outcomes. And another analysis was made public on how this happened. Nonetheless, the NIH is working very actively at remediating this issue, not only for African American investigators, but again, for underrepresented minorities. And there are different initiatives, some including the National Research Mentoring Network, also expanding or modifying existing funding opportunity announcements that really attract investigators and help them move towards independence. And a new R01 named after Dr. Stephen Katz, who used to be the director of the National Institute on Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Disorders. He was very interested in early stage investigators, and he was an advocate for them. So this particular grant, R01, doesn't require pilot data or previous data. So look at that those funding opportunity announcements because they are available. Again, these are efforts that are ongoing. It is still evolving. And we still are working towards going into the right direction. I realize it's 8:48. I'm going to speed up because I included several examples and I really want to finish my presentation on time. So in this topic, fostering research led by investigators from underrepresented backgrounds, possible directions or possible steps forward may include institutional paradigm shifts. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in some institutions that educational institutions were created with the purpose of educating professionals to address the needs of the population. But research was not part of the curriculum. So it has taken time to incorporate research in the curriculum and in the development of the students that are really interested in combining research and clinical care. Maybe promoting interest in biomedical research at early stages, undergraduate or even high school, to start presenting biomedical research as a path, a feasible path that could be combined or that could be taken to improve the health of the population. Also, innovative research. We need to really rethink our questions. If we are asking the same questions but expecting different answers, do we need to ask different questions? Are we asking the right questions? And mentoring that promotes independence. The opioid epidemic, a big one, and NIH has a big initiative called the HEAL initiative, helping to end addiction long term. And within the HEAL, there are several programs, and I am mentioning two of them: the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study, which focuses on children that have been exposed to opioids in utero, and an initiative on back pain, the backpack, because back pain and muscle and musculoskeletal pain is a reason for prescribing opioids, and how we can really address and maybe explore other treatments that postpone the use of opioids, or that we can wean patients from opioids into other alternatives. Now, a research of my own, I am an endocrinologist, as you heard before, and upon moving from NHOBI to NIMHD, I really felt compelled by the persistent disparities in diabetes care and diabetes outcomes in individuals from minority groups. And I, with a collaboration of colleagues across institutes within the NIH, we put forward a funding opportunity announcement to really look at the implementation of guidelines of healthcare for persons with type 2 diabetes specifically, that come from populations with health disparities. I chose this illustration here from the New York Times because it really compelled several things. The illustration is focused on the cost of healthcare, which are amazingly high when we look at how much diabetes costs to the US. And most of the costs are really driven by preventable hospitalizations due to complications that could be prevented. But also the illustration has drops of blood and the testing of glucose, but it's also the burden, the toll that it takes on patients. And we look forward to really seeing very good applications and funding them that promote good responses and answers to this critical issue. Now, COVID. Upon the onset and declaration of the pandemic, NIH moved very quickly to tackle this issue from many, many perspectives. And one of the initiatives that was formally created is the SEAL initiative, that really fosters community engagement and provides tools, provides instruments, and community conversations with researchers and with the patients. Another one, led by the National Institute on Child Health Development, is it's called Prevail Kids, and is an RFA that was issued to really look at children who suffer from the multi-system inflammatory syndrome, like the Kawasaki-like syndrome. And they have already been awarded, and the work has just started. So this is a unique opportunity to understand COVID-19 and children. Now, in NIMHD, we first started by issuing administrative supplements. I mean, they were competitive, administrative supplements to already funded projects and that could incorporate the measures of impact of COVID-19 in the populations of interest. And we received over 119 applications, and about 35 or 36 were funded. Also, across the NIH, the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, the RADACs, was initiated, and it has 3 or 4 components. Now, NIMHD is the coordinator of the RADACs UP, the RADACs underserved populations. And the main focus of this initiative is to developing testing, an expanded testing of COVID-19 in underserved populations. So far, within the scope of this big project, there are close to 67 or 70 projects that are being coordinated by a single coordinating center and NIMHD. And more recently, we have issued a funding opportunity announcement on addressing vaccine hesitancy and uptake in populations with health disparities. I want to also highlight that in our website, you can look at the toolkit on social determinants of health that we encourage investigators to use. It's a pretty comprehensive toolkit, and we look forward to really seeing some comparable measures across studies. One of my last slides is another project of mine. After my work in the recovery of Puerto Rico, I wanted to come back and use what I learned and what I saw and transform it into research opportunities. And I'm going to skip one slide on the different opportunities to do research in disasters. I could show it later during the panel discussion if someone is interested. But it led to a funding opportunity announcement on evaluating the long-term effects of disasters in healthcare systems that serve populations with health disparities. And again, it was out of my experience with Hurricanes Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico. And I look forward to seeing many applications on this topic. Now, the path ahead, and I have 3 more minutes. I believe that there are at least 3 components, and I wanted to focus on these, that could promote better health outcomes and in which advocacy could be inserted. And they are self-explained in this Venn diagram. Now, advocacy through research sits in the center where all the circles overlap. And it's research that it really addresses questions that are relevant to the communities of interest. It's research that studies are well designed, analyzed, and interpreted. Discoveries that lead to better health outcomes, research findings that inform policy, and questions and findings that are well communicated. And I had mentioned some of these before. As I mentioned before, I believe that researchers, clinicians, participants, and advocates, we are all part of this network of factors, and we are part patients, part participants, part researchers, and also advocates, and that we are also impacted by other sectors, and this needs to be considered too in our research. Now, from the participant standpoint, participants need to be on the spotlight. And as advocates, as researchers, we can provide or facilitate that by including their opinions in the research study design, by research methods that have an active voice, that put the patient or the participant in understanding how they make decisions and when they make decisions and why. And also on how they feel collecting more information about treatments and about the performing of the research in terms of feedback. but also us sharing research information in a timely manner, implementing findings and lessons learned, representing their voice accurately, not interpreting their voice, representing what they really said, and educating patients, study participants, and the population to speak for themselves. We also need to account that patients also have biases, and that's part of the conversation in clinical care, and that we can advocate for this issue as well when we are faced with situations in which the communication with patients or study participants is not optimal. It's already 10 my time, 9 yours, and I think I don't want to stop, but I'm sorry that I am going over time. I'm going to stop there because I want to be respectful for the time of my colleagues, and maybe I can show the few other slides later. Is that okay?
That is quite all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Avila Santa, for a most enlightening and informative presentation. We will have plenty of time for questions for Dr. Avila Santa during our 10:15 a.m. Q&A session that will take place with both Dr. Avila Santa as well as Dr. Cortico and Ms. Cortico. So we look forward to hearing from you more later this morning.
Thank you.
I am now delighted to introduce our next two speakers. I will start with Dr. Mira Cortico. Dr. Cortico is a pediatric surgeon at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, CCHMC. She earned her medical degree from Harvard Medical School in 2009 and completed her general surgery residency at the University of Washington in 2016. During her residency, she completed a 2-year research fellowship in surgical outcomes at the Surgical Outcomes Research Center in Seattle, as well as a master's in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health. After her general surgery residency, Dr. Cortico completed her pediatric surgery fellowship at Cincinnati Children's and joined the faculty in 2018. Dr. Cortico serves as the Director of Pediatric Surgery of Global Health Programs at CCHMC and the Associate Director for Trauma Services. She is a member of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, as well as the Children's Oncology Group's Renal Tumor Committee. As the Director of the Pediatric Surgery Global Health Program, Dr. Cortico works in Uganda in partnership with local Ugandan pediatric surgeons to help strengthen the healthcare system's ability to care for children with surgical diseases. Dr. Cortico's work at CCHMC, both through her global surgery focus as well as in her research, focuses on equity and access to care. Her goal is to ensure that all children have access to the care they need to live full, healthy lives here in the U.S. and abroad. Her focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion bridges her clinic and research activities to link with her leadership and administrative roles. She services on the ACS Committee on Trauma's EDI workforce, as well as her institutional faculty DEI task force and the Department of Surgery DEI steering committee. Welcome, Dr. Cortico. And on to Ms. Kalpana Cortico. She is the daughter of 2 doctors and the sister of Dr. Cortico, who is one of our esteemed panelists today. She chose to pursue law instead of medicine to address what she has described as, quote, the subtext of discrimination, exclusion, and otherness, end quote, she experienced growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio as a first-generation Indian American. Ms. Cortico is a partner at Cohen Milstein and has become a nationally acclaimed employment and civil rights litigator and a leading voice on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She represents women and other disenfranchised people in high-profile litigation involving pay and promotion discrimination and issues related to access to healthcare, the ADA and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Ms. Cortico is also perhaps best known for co-authoring The Inclusion Rider, a groundbreaking employment contract addendum made famous by Oscar-winning actress Frances McDormand in her 2018 Best Actress speech. The Inclusion Rider fosters DEI in hiring, DE&I hiring in the workplace. She is currently involved in high-profile litigation with the ACLU Women's Rights Project and is representing 69,000 women in a pay and promotion gender discrimination class action. She also recently negotiated a groundbreaking gender affirming surgery coverage between the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund and Aetna. Her op-eds on diversity, equity, and inclusion have appeared in the Washington Post, The Hill, and others. She is also a prolific public speaker and has spoken to a wide range of audiences, including the Democratic Attorneys General Association, the American Constitution Society, and as the commencement speaker to the graduating classes of Penn Law and UC Irvine Law School. Welcome, Ms. Cortico. On a very personal note, I have the honor and privilege of having grown up with these two incredibly inspiring and power women. And they say it takes a village to raise a child. Kalpana and Mira, I am so thankful that you were a part of my village. So such an honor and a privilege. Welcome. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks for having us. This is the first time Mira and I have done this roadshow together, where we get to talk about our mutual expertise in different pieces of this, and we're excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I think Kalpana and I, we're going to do this more as a conversation than as a talk. So we hope that folks will chime in the chat if you have questions or comments. I think we really encourage that, and we'll try to address them as we go. Otherwise, we'll kind of turn to them when we get towards the panel. But we're going to mostly chat with each other and talk to you a little bit about the work that we do. Kalpana, do you want to reflect a little bit on how you got here and kind of why this is an area of expertise for you? And then we can, sort of dive in after.
Yeah, so I came into DE&I work actually from really seeing what I would describe in a more crass way in other settings with some swear words, but as really messed up workplaces, right? I deal with workplaces that have real problems, and part of coming out the other side of those cases is figuring out how to fix messed up workplaces, whether it's pay or promotion, access to healthcare, pregnancy discrimination. All of them have shared features, which is what I think we will talk a lot about. And that is actually what took me into DE&I. And actually, I'm trying to now use the term DEIA. I recently was encouraged to really build accessibility more centrally into my discussion of DE&I. So I'm trying these days to say DE&IA. I always forget it, but that's how I came to the work, is by thinking about workplaces almost like a pathologist, right? You see workplaces that are really messed up, and then you wonder about what could be done to make them better and in a more affirmative way. So that's how I got here. What about you?
So I think I'm a brown woman in surgery. So I think I came to this work and to this space based on the fact that it was my experience and the experience of otherness, both growing up as a child in Cincinnati, which Kalpana and I both experienced, growing up here, but also throughout my medical career being a brown woman in a surgical residency and then an elite surgical fellowship, and then subsequently joining a faculty which is largely made up of white men. And so thinking about the ways in which we can be better advocates and better leaders and better sponsors. And we'll talk a little bit more today, both about sort of some of the pathologies that we've seen, like Kalpana was talking about, but also some of the strategies that each of us can use to have an impact on the communities around us. So I think I'd love to start, by asking you, Kalpana and I are going to kind of ask each other questions as we go through this and see if we can get to some of the points that we want to make sure we highlight for you. But can you talk a little bit about the ways, you mentioned the workplace and really focusing on and supporting and advocating for individuals who experience discrimination in the workplace. Can you talk about some of the ways in which you think this discrimination might manifest in medicine and science based on your experiences from other industries as well?
Yeah, I think, to sort of take the lens of discrimination law and the way in which it manifests, right, sort of the fact patterns, that's the way we would describe it in the law, and then kind of impose them on medicine. I would say that really, in many ways, medicine follows the same kind of patterns or problems, has the same problems as many, many other industries. So, I mean, is that a good thing? You're not alone in that the industry is problematic, but also I think it really reflects some of the same systemic failures that are, true across lots of other industries. And I think one of the things that makes looking at these issues in any industry, and we're going to focus on medicine and STEM specific, is that those patterns, those problems get filtered through the particular kind of structures or dynamics or processes that are endemic to a particular setting. So in this case, medicine and STEM. And I would say that I think discrimination, whether we're talking about gender or race, but let's stay with gender for purposes of example, it's exacerbated in medicine by institutions and structures and processes, and we're going to examine those in a little bit more depth as we go. In particular, hierarchy, which you literally just described from your own personal experience, and that's a huge driver of unequal workplaces. Perhaps not surprisingly, maybe that's stating the obvious, and so it manifests in particular ways. In the last few years, there has been, I think, much more scrutiny about these issues. And Vidya, real credit to you for putting together this conference to create space for these conversations. But really, since the resurgence of the Me Too movement in late 2016, early 2017, some researchers and some more influential bodies in medicine and the sciences have begun to examine the way in which discrimination manifests in medicine. And in particular, I don't know whether, I know you, Mira, have read it, but for folks who are listening, worth getting your hands on the National Academy of Sciences report on sexual harassment. So that's a specific category of discrimination, but it really outlines and describes some of the structures that we're talking about. They convened a working group on sexual harassment in medicine, and it in and of itself really compiles some of the best research, some of the best science and analysis, social science in this space. In addition, AAMC has put together some materials that are worth looking at. And then I think just as like a sort of a top line takeaway, I don't know that this will come as a surprise to anybody listening to this, but medicine and STEM have serious problems with respect to systemic discrimination of lots of different kinds. And we're going to sort of issue spot those as we go and talk about solutions for change. But the bottom line is there are real problems in need of real solution.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kalp. I mean, I think, one of the things that I think we have to think about is that, what does that look like, right? How does that manifest? And we're going to give some examples of that as we talk. But I think we know, right, that women now enter medicine. They enter the profession in medicine, but also in the sciences and in PhD programs and otherwise in near equal numbers to men, or in some cases in higher numbers than men. But then the progress stalls, right? The pay and promotion are not equitable. Women in medicine overall don't get paid as much as their male colleagues, and there's lots of evidence to support that. They don't advance in leadership. When we think about promotions to associate professors and to full professors, right? Women tend to stall out, and minorities tend to stall out in that progression. And that's a reflection, I think, of a lot of things, and we'll give some examples, but some of it is about the work that women take on. And we'll talk a little bit more about, Kalpana and I were talking about this term office housework, this idea of the work that helps keep the system going, but isn't always the work that we're given academic credit for. And that academic credit, unfortunately, right, the structures of promotion that exist in medicine and in the academic world are very rigid. They focus on publications and on grants and things like that. And not that women aren't doing exceptional work, but that work is also sometimes piled on with additional work around, okay, you're the program director, and what does that educational piece look like? And how is education worked into the metrics around promotion? Or you're focused on DEI and you're leading your institution's DEI workforce group, but is that integrated into promotional categories? Usually not, right? So that in some ways we see that while women are entering the workforce and clearly contributing massive amounts to the structures and to the success and to the thriving of those institutions, they're not necessarily promoting along the same trajectory, and the inequities in pay are rampant. Let's go back. Sorry, Kalp, did you want to say that?
I think, Amy, one theme that we didn't put into our notes, but that your comments just made me think of and we should come back to, both in terms of promotion and in terms of hiring, are what proxies get used, what factors get relied upon in making those decisions, both at the hiring stage and at the promotion stage. And one of the things I think you're describing, and this is true, we can come back to this in more depth later as we're talking about how to change systems, but like, if you're using proxies that only measure part of what people's contributions are, which is to say you're only looking at their publications, you're only looking at their grants, you're not looking at the way in which their work sustains the institution, facilitates hiring, supports staff, trains,
educates, right?
Exactly, educates the next generation of physicians, then you're missing crucial proxies. Like you're relying on variables that are incomplete. And so let's come back to that as we're talking about, systems change later. But that was something you and I hadn't put in our notes that what you just said reminded me of.
Yeah, so I think what we wanted to talk about now, I think, Kalpana, before we kind of dive into the ways in which discrimination manifests in medicine, some strategies and some change-making kind of orientation, we really want to make sure we leave you at the end of this hour with some things you can do going forward, not just to say, yay, there's lots of problems, we've identified there's lots of problems, but here's some suggestions for what you might do in your organization, in your community, in your division, in the national organizations you serve to address these. So we really want to make sure we get to that. But Culp, do you want to talk a little bit about the technical legal side of discrimination?
Yeah.
What's the legal background? And as we think about how it manifests in medicine, what do you do about it in that context?
Yeah, I think I want to start by just saying that there is behavior, and perhaps this is the most common category, what I'm about to describe. There is behavior that is really problematic, but that doesn't rise to what I would describe as the kind of legally actionable standard. So, put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that because I think that's about systems change. But I just want to note that, like, the law doesn't get us all the way there in terms of fixing messed up workplaces. It's just not perfect. And, there are a lot of us who are working to fix that. But for those of you who are following Congress, moving anything through Congress is a Herculean effort. So, put that aside for a minute. I think so. There are a few sort of basic statutes that we rely upon in the legal setting to deal with discrimination. The first one is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which provides that you cannot have discrimination in the workplace that gives rise to an adverse employment action. Adverse employment action is sort of the technical language of the statute, or that impacts the terms and conditions of employment. So talking about pay discrimination, discrimination in promotion, discrimination that leads to terminations, pregnancy-related discrimination, discrimination that in some cases, like severe discipline that can impact your ability to be promoted or transferred. Those are adverse employment actions. And then also terms and conditions. Like here's the kind of current example. If a spouse in a heterosexual relationship has access to healthcare through the employer, then a same-sex spouse also needs to have access to that healthcare, right? So those are terms and conditions of employment. Title VII deals with race, it's a broad statute. It deals with race, it deals with gender, it deals with national origin and ethnicity, it deals with religion. And then since the Bostock decision a year ago, it also now explicitly encompasses gender identity and sexual orientation. So it is a broad statute that we use to get at discrimination, whether it's individual or systemic class type cases. There's also the Equal Pay Act, which, as you might imagine, is about equal pay. It is limited to gender, so it's just for women. I think it hasn't been tested yet, but it occurs to me that it should also be for trans women, gender identity based discrimination as well. It requires you to identify a comparator who is doing similar work to you in a similar setting, right? So you have to figure out the person or people who are your comparators when you're facing unequal pay, and that makes it a little bit trickier for some reasons, but easier for other reasons. So that's the Equal Pay Act. The third statute I want to mention is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which amends Title VII. So it's sort of a cousin of the Civil Rights Act. And it, of course, deals with discrimination during and after pregnancy, before, during, and after pregnancy. And that is, in many ways, a statute that hasn't received enough attention. My case against AT&T Mobility right now deals with pregnancy discrimination, and that's a tricky statute. So that's kind of the landscape of the legal world. I just want to sort of reiterate, I think whether the conduct is actionable or not under these statutes, as we've talked about, Mira, the kind of ongoing microaggressions that people face in the workplace, and I think this is really true of medicine, it undermines their working environment, and it's a huge part of the problem. So the legal framework is really important because it creates a backstop, but it's not the end of the conversation by any stretch of the imagination.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that's a really important point, that we recognize that the legal statutes are really important, and we need to be able to use them and employ them to advocate for rights for individuals, but also recognizing that that alone is not going to address a lot of what people experience in medicine, which are those microaggressions, which aren't that micro, or the things that undermine credibility, competence, promotion, pay, right? All of those things in really subtle ways that you might not be able to necessarily litigate, but that have a significant impact.
Sometimes can, and
Yeah.
I like to bring those cases,
Yeah.
and in particular where there's systemic failures, like we can. But I do think it's really important to acknowledge the like daily
Trauma,
the daily kind of hits on your dignity that
Yeah.
show up. And actually, I think, Mimi, that's probably a good time for you to talk about like the way in which it really does manifest in medicine.
Yeah, so I think really important to think about some of acknowledging or identifying what we see and experience from discrimination, but also inclusion, access, right, diversity, all of the pieces of the DEAI work is thinking about how does it show up? How can we identify it? Do we really notice that it's there, right? It's the same as becoming aware of things that are around you. So some of the examples that I think we think about are, one of them is stereotyping, right? What are the roles that are really allocated to women? What are the ways in which we're stereotyped, right? Women are expected to be, more nurturing. They're expected to take on those nurturing roles. You need to be warm, but not, and you need to be confident, but not too confident. You need to be warm, but not too, gushy, right? All of that stereotyping and the ways in which it creates conflicts, I think, and a very narrow window for women to act in, where they're deemed, great leaders or, great teachers or great clinicians. That spectrum of behaviors is very narrow. And you live that every day, where women don't always speak up in the same instances, because if you speak up and you challenge a colleague, you'll be seen, as an expletive that I won't use here, or, you'll be pushed aside, or you'll be seen as too aggressive, right? The ways in which that shows up. I think it also shows up in the ways in which we run our teams. Go ahead, Cole.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's a real double standard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the ways in which we run our teams, I think all of us, have experienced being the, leader on a team, whether that's as a, intern with your medical student, or as a chief resident with your juniors, or as an attending, with your team, and you walk into the room and the patient turns to the white male third-year medical student and says, "Doctor, can you tell me about my plan?" And that recognition that, like, well, hi, I'm your attending surgeon over here. And so, I think that those they dig at you over time, right? That recognition that when you walk into the room, you're not expected to be the person leading the team. You're not expected to be the physician even, right? Our mom often talks about the fact that she has many times been asked to, bust the tables. She's been assumed that she's the janitor, right? She was about to give a keynote lecture. This is an interesting story, so I'm just going to throw it in here.
I don't know this story.
She was at a conference. She was about to give a keynote lecture to 4,000 people. Our mom is pretty fancy. So she was standing in the back of the room, but she's this tiny little brown woman. And somebody came up to her and said, "The trash is full. Can you deal with it?" And she said, "Okay, great. I'll make sure somebody deals with it, but I got to do something first." And they're like, "Well, the trash is full." And she's, then gets up to go give this keynote talk. And afterwards, the one came up and said, I'm not that person who assumes that about you, right? So you recognizing those little, but not so little things that happen on a daily basis, and create the sense that you don't belong, that this isn't your space, that you are out of your box, that this is someone else's space. And
I have never heard that story.
It's a great story. You should ask mom to tell you sometime. It's better when she tells it. But I think other things that we see, right? And this is another sort of really challenging part about negotiating these issues in medicine, is hierarchy. We live in a hierarchical system, right? I just talked about levels of hierarchy: medical students, interns, junior residents, senior residents, fellows, attendings, right? There's all these levels on the medical side of hierarchy, but they're also on the STEM side. And you think about PhDs and who's the postdoc and who's running the lab. And this idea that, and Kalpana can reflect more on this too, that organizations that organize themselves around single powerful individuals, right? We can all talk about John Cameron as the famous surgeon from Hopkins, right? Or Bruno Cardi as a cardiologist, or whatever those, DeBakey as a cardiothoracic surgeon. We can name singular individuals. Fauci is the one that everybody's obviously thought about now. Singular individuals that we name and we know. Labs are named after the people that run them, not the work that they do. And so that's a hallmark of a system that's really vulnerable to discrimination and power dynamics, but with that single person and the centrality of that, right? We're less comfortable firing named individuals who have lots of prominence because of the ways our systems are set up.
100%. And in fact, just a couple of resources or examples on that last point. The resource I'm about to point folks to is the EEOC's task force on workplace harassment and the final reports of that. One of my partners served on that task force, and one of my former partners was chair of the EEOC when that task force is convened. So I have a fair bit of bias about the strength of those findings, but I think it's a national task force and it's worth looking at. And it identifies, as Mira has just said, some like particular examples of conditions in workplaces that make them more vulnerable, in that case to harassment. But I take the position, my colleague Anita Hill takes the position, that workplaces that are more vulnerable to harassment as a particular category of discrimination are also more vulnerable to other kinds of gender-based or race-based discrimination. So you don't have to sort of separate those two as being kind of two separate islands. So the EEOC report, the other one I want to point to, if you look at tech and examples of recent examples of discrimination in tech, in particular harassment-based discrimination in tech, it often flows from very fancy engineers or creators who are seen as too important to the institution, too important to its profitability to hold them accountable. And that I think is what you've just described. And there are myriad examples of that. Medicine has so many.
Yep, absolutely. I think the other kind of things that I wanted to touch on, I talked about this a little bit at the beginning. So, challenges in credit for scholarship, right? Though, there's dynamics about who gets to be first author, who gets to be senior author. How do we decide that? And do we decide that in an upfront fashion, or do we decide that later? And is there bias in those decisions and in how those powers, kind of play out? But also, we talked about this in the context of promotion, right? What is the work that is being done, and are all of the things that are contributing to the success and thriving of academia and medical centers and all the places in which we work? Are all of those things on the list of things you get credit for when you get promoted, right? So we think about DEI work, right? Many of the people who are asked to do DEI, we do it on the margins. It's not something that's integrated into promotion. It's not something that you're paid for. You don't get time allocated to it. You're just expected to do it kind of on the margins. We think about education and training, residents, medical students, fellows, et cetera. Many program directors, you may get some time for it, but there are increasingly institutions that have educational tracks. But what if you're not an educational track person, but you spend time on education? Is that included in your criteria for promotion? What about the many ways in which people show up in administrative roles, helping to make call schedules and, lead in the administrative role? Those aren't things you get promoted for, but they take time, and that time takes away from publications and grants and other things. We're all fixed in the amount of hours we have to spend. And so the ways in which that plays out in affecting promotion. And then the last comment, and I'll let you chime in there, Kalp, sorry. The last comment I would make is that Dr. Avila Santa talked a lot about funding, right? And issues with funding. And I won't rehash that because she did a great job of talking about it, and probably better than I could. But really recognizing that there isn't equity in the ways in which funding is allocated, and there's bias in those decisions in many ways. And there's efforts to make that bias go away, but it's still present. And so that's another way in which this discrimination and bias shows up.
Can I ask a question? When you're talking about, one point, and then I want to ask a question. On the issue of work that takes time, that doesn't get, that doesn't get accounted for, I want to add one more piece of it, which is that not only does it take time, but it adds value, right? If somebody isn't creating the call schedule, if they're not figuring out the fellows interview schedule, if they're not making sure that folks are getting taken out to dinner pre-pandemic days, those things add value in addition to taking time. And the failure to value that work, I think, is really hugely problematic.
Totally agree.
The question I had for you was around the authorship piece of it. This is not something that we confront in the law very much, because people just write pieces, and if you're more senior, you automatically get the first authorship. There's sort of no negotiation around that. But it strikes me that you sort of mentioned something, and we can come back to it later when we're talking about affirmative strategies, but the idea of negotiating in advance what the order of authorship is, that feels like a very useful strategy.
I totally agree. I think it's a really key strategy, and I think it's one we don't get taught. But if you have a great research mentor somewhere along the line, they have that conversation. When you start into a project, when you start into work, my sort of recommendation in thinking about this approach and how do you get credit for the work you do, and how do you not do work that you're not going to get credit for, is not that you need credit for all your work. I don't mean to suggest that, but for things like publication, et cetera, right? You want to also spend your time where you're going to get value for yourself out of it as well. And I think one of those strategies is to look at the work in advance and say, what do I think the output is going to be? Is it going to be a presentation? Is it going to be a publication? Is it going to be another grant? Is it going to be whatever? And how do we lay that out up front? And so I have taken to doing that with a lot of clarity to say, okay, you're doing the lion's share of the work. You're going to be first author for this. This person's going to be second author. This person's going to be senior author. And the remaining authors will be labeled by alphabetical order or the reverse alphabetical order, because sometimes we mix it up so that the person whose name starts with Z isn't always last, right? But I think having that clarity and being really clear up front, because sometimes you have that conversation and you recognize, I'm going to be a middle author somewhere in the middle, but this is going to take a substantial amount of time. And is that worth it? And we all have our own calculus. Sometimes it's worth it to be a middle author on the Lancet Commission on Global Surgery or the whatever, right? But sometimes it's not. And having that clarity up front so that you don't have disappointed expectations and that you put in work commensurate with the credit that you'll get for that work over time. Before we kind of dive into strategies, because I know we want to get there and we don't want to miss that part, do you want to talk about other examples you see of ways that it shows up, things that might transcend industries as well?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think there are a couple and we've touched on them. One is kind of messed up promotion processes, right? Promotion processes that don't value the right proxies or that are like utterly rudderless. We in the legal profession kind of call those tap on the shoulder. And I am sure that that has some meaning to you all, where somebody without any particular value, somebody who's, you know, parent is known to somebody else, you know, sort of the informal networks that describe so many skilled professions like medicine and the law, that tap on the shoulder where somebody who hasn't actually done the work, who doesn't actually have the skills or qualifications, somehow rockets into a position.
Or even if they do, right, but there's no hiring process to assess whether or not they're the most qualified.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's the most common, right? Where somebody who's very qualified finds their way into the gig, but there were 5 other qualified people who never got a chance because the process didn't exist. There wasn't a process. So that's one. And that really defines the promotion process, as well as just like the broader advancement into leadership. And as you've very clearly identified, that's a huge problem in medicine.
Yeah, and I just was going to add that because we live in old boys clubs, right? And because, you know, that's the nature of business, medicine, law, whatever, right? The person who's most likely to get that tap on the shoulder is not likely to be the woman or the woman of color or the gentleman of color, right? Like, I think recognizing that those tend to, we talk about fit, right? When we think about interviewing people, well, fit is really about, have I picked somebody who's a lot like me? And recognizing the problems and the challenges with that.
Fit is such a problematic term, and we can spend more time talking about that in a minute. But yeah, fit doesn't work. Fit is usually like whoever was in charge decided whoever should follow them, and that's confirmation bias kind of defined. Inequities in pay, we've talked about all the different drivers of that. Biased hiring processes, sexual harassment, we've talked about the drivers of that as well. And then promotion and sort of the ascension into leadership and what the C-suite looks like. In the legal profession, which I think is a real parallel to medicine, we see a lot of women coming out of law school now, right? Law school classes are almost either as many women as men or more women than men. And the lower ranks, like the associate ranks of big law firms, are largely women as well. But somewhere around the 4th or 5th year, they all disappear, and especially women of color. And so then as you kind of make your way up into the senior leadership, this is particularly true in big law firms, but it's not limited to big law firms. It also shows up in the public interest space, which I think is a little bit more analogous to academic medicine. All of a sudden, all the women are gone, or the women who are there are only white women. There are no women of color. You know, the people of color more broadly are gone, and you're like, what the heck happened? And somewhere in that 4th, 5th year, all of the accumulating failures, you know, pregnancy and caregiving related issues, kind of indignities visited upon people by their clients or patients, like all of that stuff starts to build up, and people are like, oh my God, I just don't think this is worth it anymore. And I think that caregiving thing we haven't talked a ton about, but that's another issue in medicine, hugely impacts sort of the ability of women to make it through. So those are a few more examples.
Awesome. There's a comment in the question, I just want to reference it because I think it's a really important one, which talks about the fact that, you know, the typical article has 5 or 6 folks on the paper or more, right? How do we get promotion committees to change their promotion processes to count all authorship? I think it's a great point. And as we talk about strategies, maybe we can talk about the ways in which we integrate into leadership roles and hiring processes and promotion committees to make that push. And I think there are other things that fall in line with that, right? How do you integrate education? How do you integrate DEI work? How do you integrate those activities into things that are considered in promotion, in addition to senior authorship and NIH grants and all the other things, right? What are the other things that make, because none of us want to just be a publishing person. You also want to be a full person. You want to be a clinician. You want to be great at those things. How do those show up in the ways we consider promotion?
Maybe we should jump to that. I'm looking at the time, and somehow you and I promised ourselves we were not going to talk on and on, but we're kind of talking on and on. So maybe we should jump to the strategies, or do you want to talk? No, before we do, you have to talk about the, in particular, your research at this intersection of, you know, the way in which discrimination manifests in medicine as a workplace, as an industry, and healthcare disparities, which are, I feel like, a big topic of conversation now, particularly in the age of COVID.
Yeah, I think we'll just touch briefly on this. I won't spend a whole lot of time, but I think it is worth noting that as we think about discrimination, as we think about diversity, you know, equity, access, and inclusion, as we think about all of those pieces, right, recognizing that it's not just on the provider side or the staff side or the faculty side, that it's also about our patients. And I think, you know, there's great stuff out there in the work that Rhea Boyd has done and others talking about how healthcare, how we failed to be sanctuaries for Black and brown families. And what does that work look like for us as individuals, as care systems, as teams, to be sanctuaries, and the ways in which it manifests in outcomes. And I'll just give you two examples, and I'm on the pediatric surgery side, so you get pediatric examples, and but there's lots of concordant examples in the adult world, and I'll give you one of those too. But, you know, so their recent paper, you know, published in Pediatrics, looking at, I want to make sure that's actually in Pediatrics, and I didn't make that up, in Pediatrics, but looking at postoperative complications and death in healthy children, and clear difference in mortality rate, clear difference in adverse event rate for children who were African American. So recognizing 3.4 times the odds of dying within 30 days of surgery if you happen to be Black and you're a healthy kid having surgery, right? That is not about intrinsic, you know, differences in health. That is about the ways in which our systems are biased and our failure to rescue when kids present, you know, all of those things. The second thing I would say is that we talk about differences in mortality, but what can we do to fix it, right? There's significant evidence that physician-patient racial concordance makes a difference. So if you are a Black newborn being cared for by a Black physician, your mortality rate is half the rate of your Black counterparts who are cared for by white physicians. So just recognizing that we see things differently, we appreciate things differently, we do a better job of listening, you know, and our bias is less when we have racial concordance. And so those are race examples. There's examples about the ways in which we treat pain meds, right? That African American patients who have postoperative pain are significantly less likely to be treated at the same level as their non-African American counterparts. And so I think recognizing that we have significant inequities, we're hearing about them a lot in medicine and COVID and other things, but that the diversity that we bring to the table in our institutions is not just about making us all feel better. It's not about a belonging and inclusion. It's also about outcomes. That when we look like our patients as an institution, not just as individuals, we do a better job in caring for our patients. And so continuing to put pressure as we think about change strategies on organizations to say, you want to be the best, you want to have the best patient safety record, you want to have the best outcomes. Part of that is you need to be diverse. And that diversity is crucial to the outcomes that we see, right? There's data about women being, you know, the outcomes of patients who have female primary care physicians being better than males. And that's not to say that any individual human who falls into one category or another is exceptional or not based on any of those factors, but just that the diversity of thought, experience, knowledge, you know, all those things, we raise different points and we have different questions when we're a diverse population, and the business case for diversity that you can talk about in many other places.
Yeah, I was going to say that tracks across sort of the broader and growing body of literature around the business case for diversity. Organizations that are diverse are more effective. And I think it's really important to make this point because as you as internal advocates and change agents in your own organizations have to convince potentially skeptical leadership around why it is important to place diversity at the core of your organizational priorities. And this is the argument, right? It makes you a better institution if you reflect your patient population. And I also just want to say, before we turn more expressly to those issues, that I think Mira and I talk a lot about gender and a lot about race. And I think it is essential that we acknowledge the sort of intersectional failures in organizations, right? And I think the term intersectionality I mean, everybody's using the word these days, but women of color, especially Black women, trans women, people who face kind of multiple layers of discrimination, really struggle more, that it's harder for them. And that's not fair, right? It's particularly not fair. And so if we're talking about challenging systems of gender bias, we gotta also be talking about challenging systems of race bias. Like, that is what intersectionality means. You can't pull them apart. And I mean, again, maybe particularly salient to make that point today, the first day that Juneteenth is being honored as a federal holiday. And that's such a huge deal, but it's just a start to the work, right? We have to tackle gender bias and race bias together at the same time. There's just no way around it.
And I think really important to acknowledge that, like, those things, right? Juneteenth being a federal holiday, those are important, right? But they're not sufficient. They don't do the work. They're an acknowledgement of the pain and the problems, but they don't do the work. And so I think, you know, one of the things Kalpana and I really wanted to make sure we also highlight as we have this conversation is that, you know, it's possible to break through all this. It's possible to be successful. It's possible to transcend the systems that we live in. It's possible to change the systems that we live in. But we wanted to make sure by starting that we underscore that we recognize that the playing field is not level for every individual that shows up in medicine, whether that's, you know, sexual orientation or gender identity, whether that's race, whether that is, female, male, and the gender dynamics there, whether that's disabilities and access to resources as somebody who has a disability. And so we want to now, I think, turn to a little bit to talking about, like, what are the systems that are supposed to exist to help us, and how do we make it better, and how can individuals be change makers in their own organizations? So, Kalp, can you talk a little bit about formal strategies, formal systems that should exist to address severe discrimination and harassment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to try and be brief on this because I think that the change agent part of it is really the exciting part of the more exciting part of the conversation. Look, if you are in a well-functioning organization, institution, hospital, medical center, et cetera, you should have a well-functioning human resources space or an ombuds person who is there to, or maybe there's a committee on equity in the workplace, right? Like, I think increasingly these places exist, but the point of them should be to create a safe space for people to come in and talk about failures, to talk about ongoing discrimination, ongoing harassment, to lodge formal complaints, and for them to be well functioning. These, whatever this body is, whether it's HR or an ombuds person, they have to have independent authority to investigate, right? Separate from the leadership, because as we've just described, if the leadership sees that somebody that they value, right, they've got other priorities. If they see that somebody that they value has been accused of problematic behavior, they may step in to impact it. And so HR needs to operate independently. And I am hearing that more and more now from HR leadership on the corporate side. These are the folks who are often on the other side of my cases, but they are recognizing that they have a crucial role to play and that they have to think about themselves as more than just preventing liability for the employer, in this case, the hospital, but rather for creating safe spaces for work. So that's how it should function, right? And we know that in healthcare, it often doesn't function like that. Folks who report either face retaliation, or they don't report because of fear of retaliation, or they report and nothing happens. And so as one of the strategies that needs to be fixed is making sure that HR/ombudsperson/reporting system really works the way it should. And for those of you who are here who are in those positions of leadership, do that work, right? Look at your HR. How does it work? Is it working the way it should? That will go a long way to creating greater trust throughout your organization. And then I think, just briefly, I'll just make this point, which I sort of alluded to at the beginning. If it doesn't work, to work inside your organization, either because you face retaliation or you fear retaliation, it's important to lodge the complaint because that's a credibility point. But which maybe shouldn't be, but that's the reality of the legal structure. But then there are lawyers who do this work, who, whose role it is to represent workers who face discrimination and harassment. That's the first thing. The second thing is that both at the federal level and at the state level, there are agencies. I referenced the Eeoc before. In every state, there is an Eeoc counterpart, and you can always lodge a complaint by filing a charge, either at the federal EEOC or at the state EEOC. And that's what you do when things get really bad and the internal stuff isn't working. And then I would also say that one of the ways that you can address severe and pervasive harassment in the workplace or discrimination in the workplace is to find others who have faced the same conduct. It's much harder, even for an organization or institution that's not set up to deal with these issues properly. It's much harder for them to ignore complaints when there are multiple people making them. And there is always power in numbers. And even a sort of jaded or biased leadership or HR structure is going to get that, right? It's in their self-interest to get that. And so sometimes these are, uncomfortably adversarial, but I think it's really important to hold our power and to know where it comes from, right? Particularly in a field where it's hard to find it sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the less formal things that you can do. I think it's an interesting challenge, right? It's a challenge that people face when they deal with discrimination, harassment in their systems. And do you feel safe to report? Do what's the retaliation? What's the fear of retaliation? What's the ways in which it changes the story of who you are in the organizations that you work in, and the ways in which that influences the decisions people make about reporting or not reporting? And I think that sort of ties into one of the things that I think is in the informal system comments. And so, I'll jump out of order a little bit to talk about that, which is allies. I think we, and those allies sometimes need to be people in positions of leadership, but maybe not necessarily your boss or your boss's boss, right? The people who can hear you when you say, I'm being harassed, or I experienced harassment, or I'm being discriminated against, or I'm not being given the opportunities that I needed or wanted or deserved. Those people who can hear you and validate you. I think that validation is central to our continued success and feeling of self-worth. There's significant evidence in that National Academies of Science publication that Kalpana was talking about that women who experience harassment are significantly less likely over the course of their careers to be academically successful. And that is often, I think, because those women then experience feeling unvalidated, unheard, unvalued in those systems because nobody heard them when they said they were experiencing something that was awful. And as a result, we self-sabotage a little bit because the trauma and the pain of those experiences are very real and very pervasive, and they live in your mind and in all these interactions. And especially if you have ongoing interactions with the person who treated you in such a fashion, right? They're pervasive. So the allies, the people who can stand up for you, who can be behind the back and behind the scenes helping you. And I think that ties a lot into sponsorship too. We talk in academic medicine a lot about mentorship, and mentorship is really important, right? Mentorship is the idea that I guide you in the decisions that you make and how you move forward in your career. But sponsorship is, okay, I've been asked to give a talk, but I can't. But you know what? I'm going to ask my third-year medical student to stand up on a stage and give a talk, and recognizing that putting people forward and sponsors who can do so, right? Having diverse sponsors means that you see more diversity in the sponsorship that happens. And that is an opportunity for people to say, okay, great, you've experienced this really bad thing. We're going to help you get past it by making sure that you have opportunities that supersede the discrimination you've experienced, that put you forward for committees or for leadership positions or for talks or for things that help gain your natural sort of notoriety for all of the things that you do well.
That's right. Sponsors put their political capital on the line for the folks that they sponsor, and it's going to be a while longer before the sponsorship ranks reflect the diversity. So for a while, we have to deal with sponsors who are overwhelmingly white and male. And how do we, as women, as people of color, cultivate those relationships so that this is something that, like, this is a strategy. So for junior folks, being pragmatic about cultivating sponsors is a big thing. For senior folks, if you're senior and you found your way, pull folks up with you, right? That's what sponsors do. They put their political capital on the line.
And that's something we don't always do well in medicine, right? We achieve and we achieve and we achieve, and that we're so achievement oriented because that's the way the system values us. But it is important to recognize that we all have an opportunity to reach behind us and pull people with us, right? Even I'm not a very senior faculty member, but I have trainees and I have students, and can I provide them with opportunities that allow them to grow and to shine? And what does that sponsorship look like? And so recognizing that that's a really key way to be there for people and to be an ally and to help them grow and to provide opportunities so we continue to grow our diversity and to help with pay and promotion for individuals that might otherwise not have that.
And I'll also say that's totally right. And I'll also say, again, I've been litigating a little bit longer than you've been operating, but that's really only because your training process goes on forever and ever in medicine. And I started litigating right out of law school. So slight difference in number of years. But the reality is that by sponsoring folks, I have built over the last 15 years a group of folks who are now sort of mid-level, who are deeply loyal to me because I helped support them in the earliest stages of their work. And that's ultimately going to inure to my professional benefit as well. There's so much literature out there about how, if you are a team-oriented person, if you think about credit as in being infinitely divisible, right, that it all circles back, it grows and grows. This is just a better way to work. And the system doesn't encourage it, but boy, it pays dividends like all the way through. Even if you're thinking about it selfishly, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and Kalpana and I are pointing at each other because that's a quote from one of my mentors from medical school. So Don Berwick has always said credit is infinitely divisible, and it's a great metric to stick in the back of your mind. And remember, right, the more credit you give out, the more credit there is. And I think that is true in these instances as well for sponsors, for people who stand up and say, you know, and this happened to me as a resident. My chair, Carlos Pellegrini, gave me an opportunity to introduce somebody at the American College of Surgeons that I had zero business being on the stage doing. But what he recognized was that if I did well, if I didn't look like a total idiot while I was standing up there, it reflected well on him too, right? So the ways in which
you weren't going to, right? He knew you weren't going to.
But it reflects the ways in which our excellence, the excellence of the people who are sponsored, also reflects on the sponsors, right? And the ways in which you get credit for your sponsorship by virtue of being a generous or open person, but also putting forward excellent individuals to show that they come from your, you know, teaching pedigree and your teaching lineage. And we care a lot about lineage in medicine. So I want to maybe spend the last, 9 minutes, Kalpana, talking about what people can do to become an internal change maker. And I think the last things that we didn't touch on in the sort of strategies for individual overcoming systemic discrimination, which I just want to throw out there: negotiate, right? You have power, negotiate your pay, negotiate the research support, negotiate the ways in which you get to come to the table and the roles in which you have. And then also part of the success of negotiating and becoming an internal change maker is being excellent at what you do. And that's the part you can control, even in systems of discrimination, is showing up and being the best at what you do and recognizing that can help to transcend some of the discrimination, although it is unfortunately not always enough. And even when you're excellent, sometimes there are things that trickle down.
And it's not fair, right? It's not fair that we're asking you to show up
as good.
Yeah, right? But I think speaking very pragmatically, right? Like, one of the things that we know is that it is easier to garner political capital. It's easier to have chits that you can expend or ask people to expend on your behalf later on if you are seen as deeply valuable in an institution. And I'm sorry that that's the reality of the world we live in, but it is. Women and people of color still have to be 3 times better at their work in order to be able to advance the ball on all the other issues we care about. And it's just the reality. Someday it won't be, but for now it is.
All right, so talk about strategies, Kalpana, for becoming an internal change maker. What are some of the things that people can do in their organization to push things forward at a junior level, at a senior level, across the spectrum?
Yeah. Let me just say, just at the very, very outset, there's a lot of literature about how when women of color in particular, take on this work internally, they face some tax for it, right? Whereas when white folks do it and men do it, they get lauded for doing this DEIA work. And so I just want to acknowledge, if this isn't you, if you don't want to do this, then just go be excellent and, be conventionally successful and bring folks up with you, right? Nobody has to.
Not everyone has to fight the fight.
Not everyone has to fight the fight. You can fight the fight in your own ways, right? You don't have to be out there kind of changing systems inside.
Right. And self-care is important for each person experiencing this, right? You have to do what works for you. That's right.
So just at the outset, here's some things you can do. It's really, if you have an opportunity to get on hiring committees, get on hiring committees. If you have an opportunity to interview and be part of the selection process for residents, for fellows, for new faculty, do that, right? That's your in to challenging rudderless processes and to starting to create processes that actually work and make sense. So that's a great one, right? And it also helps to undermine sort of the traditional confirmation bias that characterizes those. So
and push those hiring committees to have implicit bias training. So I'm currently sitting on a search committee, and we all had to be trained in implicit bias before the search committee could start. And so, push to do that because it raises the question. It allows you some space to push people when you're in those hiring committee meetings to say, hey, is there a little bias here? Hey, are we being broad enough, right?
What are we actually anchoring these decisions in? What are the principles? What are they, in my profession, we talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities. Like, what are the actual qualifications that you have to do this job, and are we actually looking at those? Those hiring committees and that kind of training can really go a long way. The second thing I would say is to find opportunities to speak, present your work, speak at conferences. Make sure that your work, your brand is not hidden, right? Build it. Build your professional reputation outside your institution. It will make you infinitely more valuable inside your institution. And will also help you feel less vulnerable. I think it's really important for people to see women of color in particular, speaking on issues that they care about and showing their expertise. It's just, it changes the face of conferences. And then also, if you're organizing conferences like this one, make sure that your panels are diverse, for God's sake. You don't have to have all white folks on a panel. You definitely don't need to have all men on a panel. Diversify your panels. It's really a place that you can actually have a huge impact on changing the face of your profession. And then the last thing I would say is, oh no, I want you to talk about this. The equity and research piece of it.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked a little bit about the links between diversity and outcomes. I think it's really important to recognize that strengthens your business case for diversity, and that promoting diversity will promote better care, that we should all do the work around being, creating sanctuaries for Black and brown families and recognizing the principles of trauma-informed care in the way that we do our work. But that if we focus on equity of our patients, right, we all live in organizations where people are patient-centered, and that is the crux of what we do, and that's part of why we're all here. If you focus on that and we connect the work and the importance about diversity to patient lived experience, to diversity and outcomes, to inclusion, right, we continue to strengthen the argument for the changes that we need to make, recognizing that diversity, that experience is really important in the care that we provide, and that centering on that will give us power in our arguments.
100%. And I would just say, I think one thing that we haven't touched on, and I know we're running short on time because of course we are.
Of course we are.
Is the value of training. Mira mentioned implicit bias training in the context of hiring. I think institutions that do training and improvement as a thing in their patient work are really well positioned to think about doing training and improvement in the workplace side of things. And there are some really valuable examples of this. I stumbled across, and I now can't find the citation, but I think if you Google it, you'll find it. The University of Wisconsin in late 2016 put into place new training on sexual harassment, right? That was like all the rage as the Me Too thing was going on, as the Me Too thing was resurgent, I should say. Was the importance of sexual harassment training. But there's really clear scholarship that unless that sexual harassment training or discrimination training or implicit bias training is like baked in, it's a regular thing. It's not a thing you click through on your computer and like, check, I'm done it for the year. It has to be really interwoven into professional expectations, into accountability measures, into evaluations. And the University of Wisconsin started to do that, right? So they put out, they required the sexual harassment training, very standard, but then the medical school followed on that with clear articulation of expectations, of professional norms and standards. They conducted ongoing climate surveys. So they did it once, and then a year later, they did it again. They conducted town halls and did all these seminars, right? They really thought about workplace discrimination. And turns out that in those successive climate surveys, the numbers improved, right? If you do the training in a way that is real, that's robust, that is interwoven with your patient-centeredness, that is that recognizes that the strength of your workplace is ultimately a strength for you as an institution, like those things can actually pay dividends over time, and it's really worth figuring out how to do that. And the University of Wisconsin examples are, I think, a really good one.
And I think there's another way to consider doing that. The University of Michigan and the Department of Surgery there put together something called the Cultural Complications Curriculum. It's another way to think about it, right? In the surgical world, we do M&M every week, and every week we sit down and talk about complications related to patient care. But why can't we talk about complications related to the things and the bias and the racism and all the things that exist around us and the ways in which so it's a 12 module series that provides cases and literature up front to give you a 5-minute introduction and then some case stuff to talk about. And it's a way to integrate that training, like Kalpana is talking about, into your daily life. We do it once a month. We talk about it. We talk about those issues, and it continues to bring those concerns, understanding intersectionality, implicit bias, gender schemas, right, into people's forefront on a monthly basis.
Do you know what's so great about that is that it takes a framework that is already existing in medicine and utilizes it for a purpose that is sort of underrepresented or undervalued. And actually somebody just popped a cool podcast into the chat about working inside the tent, and thanks Laura, and issues with HR's orientation to protecting their own. This is just always an issue with HR. And so part of the systemic work, really, I'm going to be it kind of, I don't know, maybe this is controversial, but we got to infiltrate leadership. We got to infiltrate HR. Thanks, Dr. Moyer. We got to infiltrate leadership. We got to infiltrate HR. We got to get into those spaces that have traditionally been protectors of the status quo and blow them up, quite candidly. You can blow them up in a gentle, subtle, principled way.
Yeah.
You still got to blow them up, because the way that they work right now is just not working for folks. And I know we're out of time. It's 11. But
yeah, and I think we can pause there. I think the biggest thing that we really wanted to kind of hit home over the course of the hour is to say, you know, that we recognize there's lots of ways in which discrimination is experienced, that there's multiple, you know, in addition to the formal systems that exist for dealing with that, there's also lots of ways to think about the culture work, including trainings, climate surveys, accountability, robust complaint and reporting mechanisms. You know, we're integrating a report mechanism around patient care refusal and the discrimination of patients against providers, right? Lots of ways to think about how we fix broken promotion structures. Can you get on promotion committees and integrate middle authorship into thinking about things and leading to culture change over time? But it's not short-term work, and it's not superficial, and it has to be an organizational priority and be systemic. And we hope that this has been helpful to give you kind of a framework thinking about some of this, but also thinking about ways you can have an impact. And I think we will stop there.
And I think we're supposed to come back in 15. Am I right, Vidya?
Yes, yes. Mira, Kalpana, this has been such a, I have no words. It's been enlightening. It's been powerful. It's been incredibly thought-provoking. You have given us a lot to think about, and I anticipate there will be lots of questions during the Q&A period. So for all of our participants, I am going to share my screen. Laura Worrell is going to post a link for our leadership series for which the registration is available. You heard from some excellent panelists yesterday, and they will be taking a deep dive into each of their areas of expertise beginning in August. Again, these sessions are virtual. They are free. They are offered to everybody. We have Dr. Susan Hingle, who will be discussing wellness, Mr. Michael Falon talking about mentorship, Dr. Samir Vora talking about public health, and Ms. Erica Austin and Dr. Tracy Smith talking about advocacy in the community. So you don't want to miss it. Please be sure to register. As I said, Laura's going to be putting the link in the chat. And we are going to be sharing our AWIMS video, but before that, we have our second raffle, and we're raffling off 2 books. One is Letter to a Young Female Physician, written by Suzanne Coven, a powerful memoir from a woman physician. And we also have from the Harvard Business Review, Managing Your Career, specifically geared towards working parents. So Laura, I'm going to have you go ahead and draw a name, and we'll see who our 2 winners are.
Okay, first number in our sequence is number 7, and Jen has the list of names.
She is not on.
65.
Not on.
90.
Not on. She was on yesterday.
98.
Nope.
32.
think I saw this name today. Yes, Megan Elgie or Elgie.
Megan Elgie?
Can I unmute?
Yes, please. Congratulations, Megan. Please let us know which book you would like. Letter to a Young Female Physician or the Harvard Business Review, Managing Your Career.
Megan, you're unmuted. Congratulations.
If you want to let us know in the chat, Megan, or verbally which book you would like. And who is our other raffle winner?
91, Jen?
Yes, I believe this one is here too. Let me double check. Laura Reeser.
Congratulations, Laura.
You are unmuted.
So if both of you could let Laura and either Laura or Jen know which book you would like, and we will send these to you. Everybody enjoy your break. Please be sure to come back at 10:15 for a really phenomenal panel discussion with our 3 speakers from this morning. And Jen or Laura, if you could go ahead and share the AWIMS video.
I'm pulling it up right now.
Welcome back to our 4th annual Women in Medicine and Science Professional Development Conference. My sincere apologies if you were not able to hear the video. We will be sure to show it at the end of the conference, and hopefully we will have resolved the technical difficulties by then. I would like to welcome you to the Q&A session with our 3 speakers from this morning, Dr. Avila Santa, Dr. Cortico, and Ms. Cortico. I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Hyung Han. Dr. Han is an associate professor in the Department of Medical Education, and I will say she is a valued member of the AWIMS team as co-director of the research committee, where she has and continues to partake in really valuable and high quality research, particularly qualitative research. Dr. Han, I'm going to hand it over to you. I will ask our participants to please use the chat and the Q&A, which we will be moderating. And Dr. Han, I will share those questions with you.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash. Well, I want to just thank you for such a wonderful sessions this morning, such a powerful messages. So I'd like to take advantage of my position as a session moderator before getting some questions, because I have lots of questions for the speakers too. The audience, please feel free to put your questions for us. But in the meantime, I just put my questions for the panel. So thank you again. I really appreciate the kind of continuum from the being an advocacy through the kind of at the meta level understanding toward like micro level like change agent. But I cannot think of that this topic has been around for many decades. You know, it's kind of depressing to see a research paper just published is exactly same thing, and they are talking about that's exactly same thing in kind of decades ago. So I cannot think of okay, so what's wrong here? Dr. Cortico, you mentioned that we are in the boys clubs. Our world is a boys club, and Ms. Cortico, you mentioned that well, we should not fit into that world, right? So I think that we are living in the world where the rules for the game is written by the majority. And then when I think about the research, like grant award and some even promotions, so all kind of setting by the dominant group's norms and expectations. So we have to navigate through those to be actually surviving and successful. So number one question is, sometimes I cannot deny that I am accustomed to the norm that is written by the dominant group. So I have to be kind of muscular to be successful. And then I kind of unconsciously generate the norm through my work. or my behavior, my thoughts. So how we can deal with that? And then the other question is, okay, so if the foundational rules are wrong, not really equitable, we shouldn't be the kind of change agents to change the rules.
Yeah.
So I'm just want to open the floor for your insights, because it's such a powerful insight that I learned from this morning.
Maybe I'll start and then pass it to the actual experts in the field. Look, I mean, I think that this is generational work. It doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen because one of us does it. And those of us who are engaged in this work have to draw value and satisfaction from the work itself, because it will not be fixed it will not be fixed. I mean, maybe not even in our careers, right? This is long-term work. And that's not, I think that's true for any social change work. It is long-term work. It's not at all surprising, right, that power structures, when challenged, are reluctant to give up their power, right? Like, that's the nature of power. And so
right.
it requires us to be persistent. And Mira mentioned self-care. It requires us to take care of ourselves so that we can keep doing this work over the course of our careers and generate the next generation of change agents. There has to be joy in the work itself. Otherwise, it can't be sustained. And you're 100% right. I think we have to hold both of those things in there. Although they are in tension, we have to hold them at the same time. We both have to play by a rigged set of rules in order to be conventionally successful. And we have to challenge those rules over time so that we can break them down and build up something new. Like, those things both have to happen at the same time. I'll stop.
No, I totally agree. I think that one of the things that I think we are always struggling with in this work, right, is when do you push? When do you speak up? What are the consequences of that behavior? And how do you balance self-care with doing that behavior? And I think that happens in a couple of ways. I think one of the things that I've found to be most successful is finding allies for me. Those white male leaders who happen to also be allies, or on the spectrum of anti-racism, even as far as abolitionists, and to say, we're gonna be in this meeting and this topic's gonna come up. Can you bring this up? Right. And allowing them to bring it to the fore, recognizing the power of their voice in that conversation. And sometimes that means that I don't always get credit for the idea that I bring to the table. But Kalpana and I have a community organizing mentor who used to always talk about, as organizers, right, our questions are, do we want to be demonstrative, or do we want to be strategic, right? Do we want to be right, or do we want to win? And the really effective organizers are those that are strategic and focused on winning, even if that means that they don't get to be demonstrative and they don't always get to be right. And so sitting in those spaces and having allies that help push things forward, and also recognizing that it's okay sometimes to say, I'm not going to fight this fight today because I'm tired and I don't want to deal with the backlash, or I'm, the abuse of whatever. And so recognizing it's okay to also sometimes not be in the fight.
So I see there's some kind of different approaches by maybe juniors and senior, given the hierarchy and power difference. So because we would not expect the junior members to speak up despite their risk to be recognized as a problematic person. So I can see the kind of more important roles who are in the senior level or leadership levels. So I'm still thinking about what kind of practical or concrete examples that how people in the leadership position or some roles to change the norm or informal expectation can do. So I'm just curious about Dr. Avlastanta, because you are in the NIH, very, very macro level system. So I was not surprised that there are not many women grant awardee and African American men awardee because of the system issue and the norm and rules set by NIH, traditional majority rules. So I'm just curious about how what kind of norm change or expectation change or system change we can actually expect or we can be part of.
And that's a great question, and I was going to comment on your other question to my colleagues who spoke so vividly about this issue. There are several things that could happen, and I agree with them. This is not going to be changed overnight. We are working on it, and we wish it would change, but it will take some time. I think in terms of funding, we had been pondering whether there is a reviewer's bias. That's one potential aspect, and whether within the NIH, decisions about funding, especially in the areas of research in healthcare disparities, is also a little bit off or not one of the most popular fields. It also calls and begs to ask about what has the investigator who has put forward his or her application done in terms of networking, what kind of support system in terms of the education, but also knowing the intricacies of what it takes to write a good application, how to defend your proposal, and the topic that you have chosen, and the science that you are pursuing. So it's a multi-pronged issue. In terms of NIH, efforts have been made and are still ongoing at identifying potential reviewers' bias. But we also, as I mentioned, we are putting initiatives to really increase the number of investigators from diverse backgrounds that could embrace and join the research workforce and bring their perspectives, but also learn. I must say that I couldn't finish, and I apologize. I brought a much longer presentation than I thought. But one of my final slides was going to be a beautiful segue to the presentation of my colleagues. And it was about women in research and the things that we could all do. And I was thinking about the things that I experienced and listening to them and listening to all of you right now. I also think about a cultural component or the things that we learned as we grew up, the expectations on when to speak, how to speak, when it's appropriate, or are they thinking less of me because I come from this institution versus a much well-known institution. And those things could influence our executive presence and our ability to communicate with the right mentors and with coaches on where we want to go. And that was my experience. And I did not realize I was probably not paying attention to that aspect in my professional development. I was working in my research in academia. But the value of networking, the value of learning from others, what the rules of the game are, and the value of alliances, I did not think about that. I thought that research would speak by itself, but you need people because after all, the results and the outcomes are going to be about people, and it involves people to put the case forward. So that was a lesson I learned, and that I had the opportunity to develop, and I'm still learning at the NIH, working in multi-center studies and working with multiple institutes and multiple experts on effective collaborations, but learning probably looking at what I learned as a young girl and what the reality is, and take the best and leave the rest, and learn better practices or strategies to invite discussions and to make my work better or presenting it better.
Thank you. So I understand that we have several questions from the audience. So I see the chat here. Dr. Dawn, when you don't have a seat at the table yet, you witness gender-based microaggression behavior. What can you do to be an effective ally aside from listening and validating their problem? That's a great question.
It's a great question, and it actually ties in really well. There's another question in the chat about microaggressions and how do you address microaggressions towards yourself and learners, and I think they tie in really well to each other. I think you know, when you think about how to be an ally, how to stand up for other individuals, I think some of it is also doing so publicly. I think one of the things that people often experience is that and we talk about bystanders and upstanders a lot in sort of management of microaggressions and discrimination, right? The person who comes to you after the meeting and says, I'm sorry that person said that to you, I was very uncomfortable, but doesn't speak up in the meeting to say, wait, I want to make a pause and acknowledge that's a, you know, a gendered comment, or I want to call out that I think we need to approach this differently, right? I think that being an upstander, speaking up, I think that's one way to think about microaggressions towards learners, is that if you're the attending and there's an aggression towards your trainee, speak up in that moment. Speak to the patient, speak to the other provider, speak to whomever, and stand up for your trainee. Be a vocal voice that says, wait, that's not okay, and I'm going to call it out. It's not okay, and I'm going to do it in a graceful, kind way that doesn't, you know, pitch a fit, but I'm going to call it out, and I'm going to honor that's not okay, and that strength, that support, you know, from your attendings when you're a trainee matters tremendously. But as an ally, I think, you know, vocalize, amplify the voices of those who you're trying to be an ally to. So if you're sitting at a table and that person doesn't have a voice at the table, say, I really think we should ask, you know, Dr. Avila Santa about her perspective on this, because she really has a lot of experience in this space, and I want to bring her forward to talk about this. Or, you know, I think that in this moment, right, the best person to lead this work would be this person, right? That's the ways in which sponsorships show up, so that you can help to amplify the voices of those who aren't at the table, or to invite them to the table and specifically call out there needs to be a seat for them in this conversation because of their importance in that discussion.
Two other quick strategies to add to that. One is, I think if you don't have a seat at the table and you're trying to figure out how to be a stronger ally to folks around you, one of the things you can do is to cultivate allies who do have power. So when I was a more junior person, would go into meetings with partners that I trusted and say, I actually think that was kind of problematic, and I don't have power yet, but you do. And so when you next see that, can you speak up? Can you look for an opportunity for that person? So you're training your seniors who may not see it to get it. The other thing that I think is there is that even if one of the things that we see happen all the time, right? I don't think this is gonna come as a surprise to anybody, is that women or women of color, people of color generate a great idea in a meeting, and 5 minutes later, the dude takes credit for it. And you're like, wait, I just said that, right? One of the things that we can do, and in fact, my women partners and I do this very affirmatively for each other, we lift up each other's ideas. Yeah, you know, dude at the end of the table who just took credit for Dr. Codigal's idea, I actually think Dr. Codigal just said that 5 minutes ago. And that is like, everybody will nod their head because they heard you say it, but they didn't feel like they could say it. And sometimes just doing that is really powerful. The last suggestion that I'll suggest that I in fact have used in my own practice with my partners in the legal profession, which is similarly complicated, is that when we have successes, we celebrate each other's successes publicly. So there will be an all-firm email about a settlement or a big win that one of my women partners or women associates has had, right? Like, we will make their successes known publicly to the entire firm, and we do that for each other. And that's just like a pact that we have with each other to celebrate each other's successes and not worry that somebody else won't see them. We make sure that they're seen. So those are kind of,
you won't have all your partners won't do that, right? But cultivate the people who will. And I think, you know, Amy put in the chat that, right, not speaking up in the moment is saying the microaggressive behavior is okay. Being a bystander, right? Being a passive bystander and not an upstander is actually microaggressive in its own way, right? So recognizing when you're in those moments, when you see something that happens to the people around you that is not okay, raising your voice as an ally, as an advocate, is really important to helping to change the culture and to call it out when it exists. Calling it out later is helpful. Calling it out in the moment is even more powerful.
Scared, there's great training around how to do this, right? Like there are lots of folks, particularly in the wake of the of the resurgence of the Me Too movement, who are teaching how to speak up to challenge problematic behavior. So seek those trainings out.
Thank you. I know Vidya has a couple of questions from the audience as well. So Vidya, would you like to speak up?
Yeah, I sure can. So I actually have a question for Dr. Avila Santa. So Dr. Avila Santa, in your article that you referenced on research funding for Hispanic and Latino disparities research, in the discussion of that paper, there was something that really caught my attention. And you start with a story of the 1940s photographer Jack Delano, who was employed by the Farmer Security Administration. And he was taking photographs of not only just the farmers, but all aspects of the current social conditions in the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And he talks about a 14-year-old boy that he took a picture of, and the boy's personal story of poverty and interest in photography really, struck a chord, and he gave the boy an autographed picture, and he asked the boy, "What do you like about my pictures?" And the boy replied, "I like the pictures because they make ordinary people important." And then you follow up with a quote by Cesar Chavez, who said, "The fight is not about the grapes or the lettuce. It is always about the people." So in your, I see a hooray from Kalpana. Yes. So I want all of you to reflect on the people. So, starting with Dr. Avila Santa, how do we mobilize our patients, the people for whom we're creating this work and this research for, to bridge the gaps and disparities? How do we give them a voice? How do we mobilize them more? And Kalpana and Mira, when it comes to women in medicine and science, those who are marginalized, how do we give them a voice? So I would love to hear from all of you as exceptional leaders.
Well, thank you, Vidya, for that wonderful question, because I wanted to really talk about that. One thing that I wanted to mention on what we could do to empower and lift up the voice of our patients and study participants is giving them the active voice. Patients, participants, they have a power of decision making that is guided by knowledge, is guided by their cultural beliefs, is guided by their intuition, and is guided by what they are learning, among other things. Sometimes their decisions are not agreeable with our decisions, and in clinical practice, we may call them difficult patients. But we need to respect the fact that they are their own being, and we can educate them to provide them with the right information or more information that will help them make a better and more informed decision. At the same time, using that scenario comes research. And in research, sometimes in health disparities research, we think or put the participants in the passive mode. For instance, some of the methods or surveys ask, example, how many times did you receive healthcare in the past year? That's a question that is passive. Should we ask, or in addition to receive, did you seek healthcare? Because it will give you different information, and it will help you understand the whole picture, not just what was received, but also what triggered my own interest in seeking healthcare, what triggered my interest in pursuing this action. And that way we can better craft interventions and understand also the etiology of disparities. Because certainly there are disparities that could be embedded or caused by system or outside of the patient factors. But there are other factors that we could probably control, no matter our income, no matter our level of education. In doing so and taking all of this into consideration, also the active voice comes through education and also listening to what the patients have to say about the healthcare that they are receiving, actually fostering, really inviting them to share what they want to say or ask. And I stimulated my patients and encouraged them, please ask all the questions that you want to ask. You don't need to be afraid. And again, it comes the cultural component that sometimes our patients come from a culture that we don't ask questions, that persons in authority, we believe what they have to say. And we want to break with those paradigms in a healthy way to really foster and give them that voice. And finally, another example with Hispanic health, there is and still is an apprehension from community leaders, from researchers, about asking certain sensitive questions about immigration or a place of birth, for example. And that may impair the collection of very important information that will help us understand access to healthcare, strategies for better access, but very importantly, the quality of care that our patients receive. And we had an experience in the Hispanic Community Health Study in that at the beginning, we didn't want to directly ask these questions to participants. But as we had the opportunity to administer the surveys again, we pondered about asking some more specific questions about immigration, etc. And we sought advice from community advisory groups, and we sought advice from the participants themselves. The advisory group said, no, don't ask those questions. You are going to lose the study participants. But the participants said, ask us the questions. We want to answer those questions. And we want to know how you're going to use the answers. So we modified the questionnaires, and there was no effect on the retention of participants. So sometimes we think for our participants or our patients, but they have their voice. Listen to that voice. Do not interpret it. Just be completely transparent about what they are saying and work from there.
Powerful. Thank you. Mira and Kalpana, what are your thoughts about mobilizing the masses to affect change and giving those that are oppressed a voice?
Mira, dive in.
Oh, I was going to let you go first. Sisters. So I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I think there's lots of ways to try to approach that. I think some of it is about what we've been talking about today, right? About allies and sponsorship. I think Dr. Villas-Santos points about community engagement, right? Community-based participatory research. We talk about patient, advocacy groups and having patients as part of our study groups. That work is hard, but it's so important. And it makes what we do so much more relevant. When we bring patients and families into the discussions about research that we're having, we're actually answering questions that matter to them, as opposed to picking what we think matters and making assumptions about what that looks like. And I think that's really key to the work that we do. I also, I also think that from the perspective of thinking about how we advocate for ourselves, right, the masses within our own groups, it's really about power and numbers, as Kalpana was mentioning, forming groups together, finding allies, finding people around you who support you. It makes you feel a little less crazy sometimes when you need support, and you have people who can say, yep, I see that, I heard what you're experiencing, and you don't feel like you're out there by yourself. And I think that, you know, that sort of power around allyship and how you speak up together as one voice gives you a lot of credibility. I don't know, Kalpana, if you have other thoughts you want to throw in there.
Mira and I can probably tell, or I guess I should say Dr. Cortico and I, as you should probably tell, right? Because that's one way that this shows up, is that women don't get the benefit of their title. So my sister and I, as you can probably tell, come from an organizing background. We both think about this in terms of building power. And Dr. Avila Santa, I loved hearing the Cesar Chavez quote, because I think that it all comes from the same place of recognizing the value of, in my case, it's my clients, your patients, and trusting their autonomy, while also simultaneously really bringing them along on, you know, where they are, right? Like, as an organizer, I always think about meeting people where they are and bringing them along. And that, I think, is really central to this work. I also think, and I think about that in the context of my clients all the time, right? Where they start the process and where they finish the process is radically different. And they are themselves empowered by going through it. In many cases, like, they thought it was a discrete problem and it turns out to be a much bigger one that they didn't originally see. And then they see it and they think, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that that's what was going on. They are transformed through that process in the same way that I suspect your patients are. I also think that, and I just, my kids are 9 and 6. And my older son in 3rd grade for the last couple of months has been studying change makers. They've been studying change makers in social studies, which is so fun. And one of the things I loved about it was that the curriculum allowed, you know, touched on the Rosa Parkses and the Mahatma Gandhis and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, but it allowed them to go much deeper into the unsung change makers, the folks who organized the food and transportation that allowed the Montgomery bus boycott to be successful, right? Like, how did all those folks get to work for a year as they boycotted the bus system? There were unsung heroes who made that systems change possible. And I think where we can lift up the voices of, as Mira, I think Dr. Cortico has correctly identified, if we can lift up the good ideas of others around us, the voices and experiences of those who are doing the work and not getting credit for it, that goes a long way to building power and to changing systems. And so I go back to my 3rd graders' social studies curriculum, and I'm now not even going to remember the individual's name, but he studied this incredible woman whose entire job was organizing the carpool that allowed the Montgomery bus boycott to move forward, right? Rosa Parks did her brave, heroic thing, but none of this was an accident, right? They had been strategizing around this for years. And so how did they make it happen? They made it happen because they were organizers.
I think I would also say that it's much easier to amplify the voices of those around you than it is for us to amplify ourselves, right? We all have discomfort of speaking up and saying, I'm brilliant at this, please pick me. It's much easier to say, you know, my sister, who I think I now have to call Ms. Codigal, which also sounds weird, is brilliant at this, please pick her, right? So I think that amplification of others is way more natural and way more comfortable to us. And so by doing that, we continue to build that power and that voice.
I love that. And I think it also underscores the notion or the fact that you don't need formal authority to lead. It's often those with the informal authority that are impacting change. I know we're a little over time, but I do think it's well worth to ask my last question. We were empowered by people's stories yesterday, their advocacy stories, their personal reasons for why they're doing this work. Briefly, I would like to hear each of your advocacy stories. What was that incident? What was the moment that really propelled you into this work and made you realize that you were going to do advocacy work through your careers?
You thought you'd end with a softball question. I think, and maybe Kalpana and I probably have similar roots in the sense that we were raised by parents who really came from disparate environments and had an intrinsic focus on fairness and on equity. And I think without even really realizing it, that's how we were raised, with this idea that the world should be fairer, that people should be provided with equal opportunities, and equal, not just like you don't have an education, but here's the same job as somebody who does, but like, how do I get you to the right education to allow you to be as successful in that job? And what, you know, equity as opposed to equality, and really pushing people forward. And so I think for me, you know, the work really stems out of equity-based thinking. Every child should have access to the same health outcomes, regardless of where they live or who they were born to. I fundamentally believe that, and that drives my global surgery work, and it drives my work on equity in Cincinnati, but it also derives my desire to think about how we do diversity, equity, and inclusion within medicine, because all of those things I think are integrally linked. So I guess it's my parents' fault. I think it's probably the best way to put it, and really that they've driven us to the sense that, and I don't think I see the world any other way, right? I see inequities and lack of fairness around me, and they trouble me, and they dig at my soul. And so I feel like my life's work is to try to make them a little bit less.
Mira, do you remember this? When we were little kids, I'll be really brief. When we were little kids, we had just left the theater in Cincinnati, the Playhouse in the Park, and we went to this little pizza place that's no longer there. But we walk in, and it's a Saturday night, it's busy, and we're waiting for a table. And all these other folks get seated ahead of us. And we are sitting kind of awkwardly in the front of the house waiting for a table.
In our Sunday best, because we had just come from the theater.
Theater, right? And this was in the 1980s in Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati's a really different town now, but these are real issues. They remain real issues. And I remember I was old enough, Mira, I don't know if you remember this, but I was old enough to see how uncomfortable my parents were, and how they could see what was happening, and how it was an assault on their dignity and their sense of their worth. And we left. We finally left. After not being seated, right? Watching white families be seated ahead of us, as we just waited and kept being told there wasn't a table available. And look, that's bad. And it is, but we are so privileged, right? We have had access to the best education, the best schooling, the best opportunities. And so that little tip of the iceberg, at least for me, gave me a window into what it must be like for people with less privilege than we have. And with a history in this country of such horrific and systemic abuse. And I won't forget that experience. And so that has been, I mean, I was a little kid, but Mira and I started organizing and being involved in social change work when we were teenagers. This is just baked into who we are, I think.
In my case, I can recall maybe 2 instances. And first, I did not realize I was working in advocacy. But like I said in my presentation, maybe it's implicit and we don't call it that way. But the first example or experience that I recall is moving from Puerto Rico to Texas to do my fellowship in endocrinology. In Puerto Rico, I had the exposure to Puerto Ricans and there are other Latin Americans living in Puerto Rico. But in Texas, I did have the opportunity to understand the concept of minorities, and moreover, the other Hispanic groups that I had not been acquainted with. And the differences in perception of health and disease, but also the social factors. And also the healthcare system. One of the things that struck me first when I started my fellowship was admitting patients with HIV/AIDS and how well they looked and how the treatment was different. And I would tell my interns and my residents, you really have not seen AIDS like I saw in Puerto Rico, and this is back in 1995. Secondary infections that they never saw and ever seen because the differences in treatment were radical. But going back to the Hispanic community, to me, it triggered a very profound effect on understanding the similarities and differences across cultures, because certainly we have historical similarities, but we also have some differences that could be influencing our health outcomes. And I took that as one of my objectives in my institution, to try to create that awareness. So that really was my path to NIH, to then lead the Hispanic Community Health Study of Latinos. But my second event or experience was with the recovery in Puerto Rico. I had been a healthcare provider in healthcare systems. I had been a patient. My family had been a patient, but I had never seen healthcare systems the way I saw them after a disaster. It's like opening a patient and looking at their cavities and understanding how things work and the operational aspects of healthcare systems when you drop a disaster in them. And a system that has health disparities to start with and low resources. So although I had not really considered that aspect of research in my path, I was more focused on clinical research and understanding diabetes and preventing cardiovascular disease. I thought, this is a great need, and I want to take this back to NIH. And I put the funding opportunity announcement forward, the concept for the long-term effects of disasters in healthcare systems. So I think those have been my two pivotal moments. And clearly, they have taught me that we also have thought of our careers and vocation in a certain way, because that's what we learned. But it can take us in different paths and different directions that could be life-giving and really enlightening.
Thank you so much. This has been truly powerful and inspiring. And I want to thank each of you, Dr. Cortico, Ms. Cortico, Dr. Avila Santa, and especially Dr. Hahn, for moderating this discussion. Thank you so much. Lots of pearls to take back, and wish you all well. And thank you for all you do to advocate and lead as you do every day.
Thank you for inviting us. This was such a wonderful conversation. So grateful to you all.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all the experiences and insights.
And thank you for the invitation. I am really thrilled and wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So we are going to move on to our RISE-WIMS program. Briefly about RISE-WIMS. So the AWIMS was awarded the Joan F. Giambalvo Grant from the American Medical Association. Briefly, Joan F. Giambalvo received her undergraduate degree from University of Pennsylvania and medical degree from Temple University in the 50s. A board-certified anesthesiologist, she died of liposarcoma in 1971 at the age of 39. And her generous gift funds research in support of the career advancement and satisfaction of women physicians and medical students throughout the United States. And this award is funded through the AMA's Women's Physician section in conjunction with the AMA Foundation. With this grant, we established the research initiative to sponsor and empower women in medicine and science. We awarded 13 principal investigators with funding to start their own research projects, and we equipped each of them with a research advisor, an AWIMS mentor, and a colleague from the Center for Clinical Research to do statistical and data analysis. And I am so honored to have 5 of those researchers here today to present their work. And so apologies to our RISE-WIMS team. We're going a little over time. I know some of you have clinical duties. I think that we will start with Dr. Hegde and then move on to Dr. Idrizi, who have clinical duties first, and then we will move through the rest of our researchers. So Dr. Hegde, we will start with you. And just to introduce Dr. Hegde, She is an assistant professor and non-invasive cardiologist at SIU School of Medicine, and she recently opened a groundbreaking cardiac amyloidosis clinic, the first of its kind in Springfield, Illinois. So really a groundbreaking leader in every regard. Dr. Hegde, I'm going to turn it over to you to go ahead and give your presentation. And we're asking each of our researchers to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and we will reserve questions for the end.
All righty. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to go a little early. I really appreciate it. My name is Dr. Hanami Idrisi, and I'm a pediatric hospitalist and also the medical director of the PDPARE program, which is an interprofessional education program that's housed within the pediatric department. My presentation today, PDPARE Promoting Interprofessional Collaboration, is based on research that we are doing within this program. I have no financial disclosures. So we all know that interprofessional collaboration is crucial to providing high quality patient care. We also, unfortunately, know that doctors and nurses do not always work well in true partnership. And this is also true for residents and nurses. Interestingly, the group of people who work the closest together, residents and nurses, do not have a lot of specific research focusing on their relationship. More knowledge is needed about this relationship in order to be able to better promote interprofessional collaboration between them. PDPARE was created in 2019 as a result of strained relationships between our residents and nurses that was hindering interprofessional collaboration. Our research objective is to use qualitative research to analyze journal entries that were submitted by participants in our program. We would like to do this in order to explore the effectiveness of our program and also investigate any nurse-resident perceptions that exist about interprofessional collaboration. As I stated before, our program was started in 2019, very strained relationships. We hope to start a program that could allow the two groups to meet outside of the stressful clinical environment, learn from each other, and build bridges. After IRB approval was obtained, we enrolled our first cohort in June of 2019 that consisted of 7 inpatient pediatric nurses paired with 7 pediatric interns. We actually paired them based off of results from the Colors Personality Survey and opted to pair contrasting personalities to make it a little bit more interesting. The nurses participated. This was voluntary on their part, and it was strongly supported by nursing leadership at St. John's Children's Hospital, but our residents were required to participate as part of the residency training program. After we announced the program and enrolled our nurses, we had our first orientation in June of 2019, and that was where we introduced the program. We paired them. We actually created an activity called the Top 10 List, where we had each side present what are the top 10 things you wish the other side knew on July 1st. The nurses offered very practical advice about not promising families quick discharges and telling them about stat orders, but also were very kind to offer their help and say that we want to help you, please seek out our assistance. The residents, on the other hand, the interns, were very vulnerable, and they actually talked about their insecurities, their worries, their doubts about becoming new doctors. So this activity served to bond them, I believe, in the beginning of our program, and it was referred to throughout the program because of the themes that were generated from those top 10 lists. Following this, we had some meetings. We had 4 meetings that are listed here that illustrate sorry, I was not in presentation, I apologize, that showed the different topics that we discussed, misconceptions, problems with communication. And then we graduated our first cohort in May of 2020, which was interesting with the COVID meeting restrictions, but we were able to do so. So as I mentioned before, qualitative research was the analysis of journal entries by participants in our program. Our research group, which consisted of myself, an attending, a resident, a nurse representative, and a medical education representative, we analyzed 50 reflected journal responses between the dates of June 19th to May 2020. These were captured on RedCap, de-identified, and transferred to QDA Miner, which is the software I was able to purchase with the generous grant money that I received from the Rise Winds grant. We met 4 times. Initially, each coder was able to look at the data, think of some ideas on their own, and then we met as a group and conducted open coding sessions 4 times. Each of these sessions was approximately 1 hour. And right now we're in the process of the categorization of these codes and further relationship analysis. These are some examples of our journaling prompts that we asked them. We tried to link the questions that we asked them with the activities that we were conducting during the sessions. You can see we talked about perceptions about, the 10 list, interprofessional collaboration and communication, and generational differences. As a result of our open coding sessions, we have 3 preliminary findings that fall into 3 broad categories. The first one has to do with contextual factors. These are the factors that influence how we work together in the hospital. Both sides acknowledge that it's a stressful work environment and this may impact our ability to work well together. This came up very frequently. And there are times that our goals do not align and we may not realize that, and that could lead to hindrances in communication with each other. The second idea that was very prevalent was the idea of learning about and learning from each other. Both sides want to learn from each other. The nurses want to share their real-world bedside knowledge with our interns, but the interns also want to share their classroom knowledge, and they want to seek out this assistance. And the more we learn from each other and learn about each other, then the more we have empathy for each other, which is a big theme that we noticed, feeling sympathy for somebody who is working very hard and maybe being mistreated by a family, being vulnerable at times. It's okay to be vulnerable. Both sides talked about that, and also talked about once we learn from each other, then we can actually be more approachable, and this could actually promote us collaborating with each other. As a result of the perceptions that we noted from the analysis, the participants do feel that the outcomes have shown that we have improved communication, comfort, relationship building, and teamwork and collaboration, which is what we were hoping for. These are just some of the quotes that I pulled from the journal responses. There were so many, but I wanted to focus on the quotes that supported some of our findings that I just presented. You can see here that the nurses and the residents are talking about improved interactions, improved communication, improved comfort. The nurses, we have a lot of new nurses on the floor who feel more comfortable talking to doctors and residents, and this is a big improvement that we've seen in the past. Our next step is to finalize the codes. We'd like to categorize the codes further and then generate themes. Once we do that, we'd like to then progress to member checking, which is a method for qualitative research to prove validity or the trustworthiness of your data. We will go to nurses and interns, participants of the program, and ask them if our findings hold true to them. And then once we do that, we'd like to develop grounded theory that will help and hopefully be published that will help further relationships between interns and nurses to provide ultimately better patient care. We are enrolling our 3rd cohort, I'm proud to say this, come June 24th. They will be doing their orientation. We're building the program this year. We've grown a little bit. We've learned many lessons based on the first 2 years, and we're very excited to enroll this 3rd cohort. I'd like to thank Rise WIMS for the grant that made it possible for me to buy the research software. My coding team, Hee-Young Han, who has been instrumental in helping us with the qualitative coding process, which is very new to all of us, and also has served as my research coach and my Rise WIMS mentor. Dr. Amy Joseph and Ms. Emily Enstrom had provided the valuable nursing and resident perspective in our coding. I'd like to thank logistically Erin Bauer and Viva Prakash who have helped me with the logistics of this, with REDCap and IRB approval. And finally, my PD pair team of physician champions who have been so helpful in getting this program developed and continually helping us improve. Doctors Lack, Patterson, Siebenaler, Miner, Joseph, and Abdul Noor. And I'd like to end with the pin that we offer to all participants in our program after they graduate. I'm wearing it on my badge right now. And it's a symbol that you've done this program, that you're safe, that hopefully people can come up to you on day 1 and feel more comfortable communicating with you. I'm a proud mother because my eldest son, Juanito, when he was 8 years old, I asked him to draw a picture for me that shows a doctor and a nurse working together. And he drew this beautiful gender neutral picture unprompted. And I think that's one of my proudest parenting moments. So with that, I'm done with my presentation, and I'd like to move on to the next person. Thank you.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Idrisi, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Do we have Dr. Hegde with us? Dr. Hegde, are you ready to go?
Yes, Vidya, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay,
If
perfect.
you can share your slides, and I already introduced Dr. Hegde. Dr. Idrisi, my apologies, I had not introduced you. Dr. Idrisi is an associate professor of clinical pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Hospital Medicine and serves as the Year 4 curriculum director and Y4 elective director and PEP director. And I already introduced Dr. Hegde, who we're going to hear from shortly.
Yes, thank you, Vidya. Actually, right now, unfortunately, I couldn't present in the same computer as I tested. So they do have my slides. If you can share my slides, that would be great.
Okay, Jen or Laura, could you go ahead and share Dr. Hegde's slides? And Dr. Hegde, if you want to go ahead and start speaking, and we'll get your slides up.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So my RISE-WIMS project was about peripartum cardiomyopathy. So peripartum cardiomyopathy is uncommon, although not very rare. It is heart failure defined as an ejection fraction less than 45% that happens in the last month of pregnancy and up to about 5 months after giving birth. So in the past, since the cases were so rare, the presentation of this varies from being medically able to treat to the spectrum of cardiogenic shock and death. So over the years, most of the time it was medically managed, and now we have a lot of mechanical circulatory devices that can support and improve the outcome of patients who fall into the cardiogenic shock spectrum. So although the usage of these devices early on in patients is not great because of the limited data of these devices being used in pregnancy, our peripartum cardiomyopathy. So that's why we decided to undertake this project where we want to look at the national inpatient database to see what percentage of these patients had mechanical circulatory support and what were their outcome. So we analyzed data from National Inpatient Database from 2003 to 2018, and the diagnostic codes of ICD-9 and 10 were used to draw these index cases, and we used SAS software to analyze the data. So these are preliminary study results. I still have my statistical team, Mike and Steve, working on these. So whatever I'm presenting is still preliminary. So over the years, we have seen this graph shows the trend of peripartum cardiomyopathy over the years, and since 2003 to 10, there is an increase in cases, but these were the diagnoses coded in NIS database. What that means is where patients not being, where the coders not being very aware of peripartum cardiomyopathy was a question. But since 2004 onwards, the trend has picked up and there are more number of cases, and I'm still yet to have 2018 database analyzed. But from 2011 onwards, there is a slight drop in trend. So baseline characteristics of peripartum cardiomyopathy population were mainly in the age of 29 to 30 years. And as you see here, mechanical support were used in peripartum cardiomyopathy patients who were relatively younger, like 27 years over patients or women who were over 30 years had more medication used than the mechanical support. And among the races, Caucasians followed by African Americans were the most being admitted with peripartum cardiomyopathy. And in terms of the spectrum, as I mentioned, can vary between asymptomatic to cardiogenic shock and death. So systolic heart failure, which is the EF of less than 45 for peripartum cardiomyopathy, formed the majority. And in these cases, they were mainly managed by medications versus device support. Whereas cardiogenic shock were only 911 out of 24,000 cases of peripartum cardiomyopathy. And in cardiogenic shock cohort, about 30% of them had mechanical device support. And mechanical circulatory support was used in cardiogenic shock patients. And they form mainly the Hispanic and other races like Asians and Indians, and those races got the most mechanical support compared to the white and African Americans, which was interesting. Now, delving a little deeper into the subgroup analysis of patients who had cardiogenic shock and peripartum cardiomyopathy, as I mentioned, there were 39% of patients who required the device support for their management of cardiogenic shock, over 61% who were treated medically. And as I mentioned, there were 3.76% of females with peripartum cardiomyopathy had cardiogenic shock. And again, we see the same trend here. The device use was mostly in younger individuals relatively compared to a medication-only group. So the reason for this is not clear. Is it because physicians feel comfortable putting in the device in younger females, or is it because they are more primies in younger group? The reason is something we still have to find out, and as I said, analysis is still going on. But this is an interesting finding that the medical device use was most common in younger individuals of 26 years compared to the older females who were like 31 years, were most commonly managed with medications. And again, this graph shows the device management and the device usage in different ethnicities. And in case of cardiogenic shock, it was Caucasians and African Americans who received the device support most commonly. And again, there is a small disparity here that Caucasians had more device support, which is 39.4% of population compared to only 29.4% of population, which was African Americans. Again, there is a small disparity versus Hispanics, where most of the Hispanics were managed with the device support compared to medication-only management. Again, this is a very interesting finding, and this requires more research to find out why is there a disparity and why the Hispanic population receives mechanical circulatory device management more compared to other group which receives medication-only management. This is something that needs to be looked into. And among the comorbidity, this is again an interesting finding that historically, cardiogenic shock or peripartum cardiomyopathy was seen in females or pregnant females who had preeclampsia and hypertension as the comorbidity. That was a main player. But in our analysis, we actually found that it is preeclampsia is still one of the important players, which is 70% of the population who had cardiogenic shock had had preeclampsia. But what was interesting is now that is taken over by obesity. Obesity, there were 35% of population that were obese who had cardiogenic shock. Now there is a small shift in the trend here, and this now is one of the major risk factor that pushes them to have cardiogenic shock. Again, the reason for this is not clear, and this is an interesting finding which paves the way for future research. And this we talked about. Okay, so length of stay, again, this is kind of skewed. Cardiogenic shock in patients who use circulatory devices, they have longer lengths of stay compared to medication only. Now, this raises a question whether the mechanical device was used later on in the stages of cardiogenic shock. Is that why the length of stay was higher, or did they have any device complication? And was that the reason the length of stay higher? But either way, the median length of stay for mechanical device was 17 days with the interquartile range of 7 to 40 days, whereas medication only group had a length of stay of 8 days with a range of 5 to 13. As far as outcome in terms of maternal mortality versus routine discharge, we found that the medication-only group had lesser mortality compared to the mechanical circulatory device group. So the mechanical circulatory device group had 19% mortality compared to the medication-only group, which had 10% mortality. Again, this is an interesting finding, but also it kind of makes us think, is this device used in only patients who are at end stage of cardiogenic shock and very, very sick? Is that the reason why the death is more commonly or more in terms of mechanical device group compared to the medication only group? So in conclusion, we found that mean age of our study group population of peripartum cardiomyopathy was 30 years. Caucasian followed by African Americans were the predominant population groups, whereas Hispanics and other population groups like Asians and American Indians formed the majority who received the mechanical support for the management. This was a very interesting finding. Again, obesity, preeclampsia, and smoking were the major risk factors for cardiogenic shock in peripartum cardiomyopathy patients. Majority of cardiogenic shock patients were managed with medical therapy, and mean length of stay and mortality were higher in cardiogenic shock patients who received mechanical circulatory devices. So this brings us to some of the interesting findings, again, which I mentioned. Historically, in previous studies, it has been mentioned that peripartum cardiomyopathy is seen in patients older than 30 years of age, and it has been again and again reiterated in the literature that there is a strong association with the age as well as peripartum cardiomyopathy. Whereas in our study, we have found that the spectrum has shifted now to younger individuals, like most of them had a median age of 30 years in our study. And this could be related to the extensive comorbidities, especially the obesity, which in our study was found to be significantly associated with cardiogenic shock and peripartum cardiomyopathy. And again, the literature before had noted that African Americans were the population where peripartum cardiomyopathy was most commonly associated with, and in our study we did find Caucasians were the most found the most majority. Again, This is an NIS database where it's done in United States, so there is a little bit of bias here, so that that finding could be just related to that. Coming to the third interesting finding of having obesity and preeclampsia as one of the strong association with PPCM. Again, obesity is a new association that has been found in our study. Previously, it was not associated strongly with cardiogenic shock. And that could be because the obesity has been increasing very rapidly in our population groups compared to previous years. And that could be one of the reasons why we are seeing these in our studies. These are my references. And a special thanks to Mike and Steve from the statistics department who helped me put all the statistics together. And as I said, these are the preliminary data, and it is pretty interesting. We found striking differences from historic studies to now. And we are furthermore analyzing the results and doing subgroup analysis to find reasons for some of these. Thank you.
Excellent work. Thank you so much, Dr. Hegde.
Next,
we have, you're welcome, Dr. Dorcas Adamarola, who is an attending internist and psychiatrist here at SIU School of Medicine. And Dr. Adamarola, are you ready to present?
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's still morning. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. The work that we're doing has been creating a combined internal medicine and psychiatry clinical rotation here at SIU. And I'm really thankful because this grant has given us the opportunity to really bring this, to get this going and to create this in a way that is really structured and supported in a very helpful way. So I'm thankful for that. I have no financial disclosure, and I am so thankful for the resource persons that I've listed and many more that are working behind the scenes to make this happen. I've had research mentor, Dr. Deborah Klaman, Ewan's mentor, Dr. Hingle. I'm the principal investigator and have been opportunity to work with a resident investigator, Dr. Date Chakrabarti, PGY4 MedPsych, who is doing a lot of the groundwork together with me in this research. As well, we've had Albert Borchway, that has been a representative of the Center for Clinical Research that is also working on this project. Just as a sort of background, MedPsych or internal medicine and psychiatry combined training in the US, there are not that many programs. They're somewhere between 10 and 12, depending on how many are active in a particular year. So it's a difficult specialty to get into. And the School of Medicine here at SIU has been home to the combined internal medicine and psychiatry training program for 29 years. We're one of the oldest in the country. And students that desire to pursue combined training often seek rotations in the specialty. They want to, like I call it, have a taste before they would eat the main meal. They want to, have an appetizer, see what it feels like, see if it's a good fit for them. And up to date, we did not have any formal combined internal medicine and psychiatry clinical rotation here at SIU. We had a few makeshift or short-term rotations that were designed specifically for students that showed interest, but didn't have a committed or dedicated rotation. And so we have been doing this work using a 6-step approach to curriculum development described by Patricia Thomas and her group at Johns Hopkins University, who described the 6-step process for designing curriculums. And I'm just going to describe what we are doing so far based on that approach. So initially, we started with a problem identification, determining general untargeted needs in this area. And what did we currently have? We did not have any formal combined internal medicine psychiatry clinical rotation. Here at SIU, we have dual trained faculty. We have residents that are in training who are able to mentor medical students that are interested in combined training and who had done that actually in sort of an informal way historically. recently, we were able to do some literature searches through, our librarians to determine what published articles existed that outlined similar rotations in other institutions. We also contacted other residency programs and asked for what they had on ground, what they had designed to address this issue. So what other curricula existed in other combined programs. We were able to talk to medical students who either were seeking to determine their interests in combined training or those who were alumni who were currently in combined training programs. We determined our goals and objectives, learner objectives, including gaining and refining the skills for comprehensive evaluation of patients that had combined medicine and psychiatry problems. We determined our process objectives, how we were going to achieve this opportunity or this program. And primarily, we are looking at outcome objectives. What is it that we want to achieve by creating this rotation? And we determined that our goal will be to clarify learner aspirations. We don't necessarily want to either coerce or whatever, intimidate or, well, encourage people necessarily to do med psych as much as we want them to determine for themselves whether or not this will be a good fit for them. So whether they come out of that rotation saying, you know what, I've been through it, I see what it is, and this is not good for me, or they go through the rotation and come out and say, you know what, I've been through it, this is what I want to commit the rest of my life to. We want it to be that opportunity for our students and for students from other institutions. And so the educational strategies that we have so far determined to use include those that are already evidence supported and known to be ideal for adult learning. And so we've determined to use case-based learning, standardized patient encounters, for which the grant is being very useful to be able to do that, because standardized patient encounters are going to involve some sort of funding to create those. So we're really thankful for that. We're going to be having students observe and participate actively in clinical encounters. They're going to use online learning resources, and they're going to have opportunity to discuss in small or individual groups and to reflect on their experiences. So far, the implementation process has involved curriculum directors and leadership of the MedPsych residency training is nested or is housed in the psychiatric. Should I say the MedPsych division is housed in the psychiatric department. So we've had leadership of psychiatry department support this work. We've had faculty, including MedPsych faculty, support this work. We've had support staff, and the Abrams grant has been key in sort of jumpstarting and getting this going. And we also have research support for outcome analysis by the time that we start to generate some outcomes. We've had approval granted. I should mention that this did not require IRB approval because of the nature of the work. And so we went on to have approval granted for the curriculum in March of this year. And our first set, I'm excited to say our first set of medical students will be starting. We'll have the first set in August of this year. It will be a 2 to 4 week clinical rotation with combined MedPsych trained faculty in the outpatient setting. Assessment methods is where we are in this process. So I talked about what we've already done, and we are currently working on creating, first of all, we are designing case-based learning opportunities that we are going to be using with students that pass through this rotation, as well as we already know that they will be going through clinic, having direct observation and all that, but we're also designing standardized patient encounters, the actual encounters that would have built-in feedback for students to experience. And we are designing structured and unstructured interview process that would help students determine their interests, but also what tools they will need and what they already might have inbuilt into them to help them go through a rotation in MedPsych. For instance, an interview or an assessment of their grit, their ability to stick to it, to last through 5 years of rigorous combined training is something that we will be determining and assessing. Oh, okay. These are my references, the curriculum development tool that I referred to earlier. This is a reference for that. And I just want to say a big thank you I really am thankful for this opportunity through the Rise WIMS grant for acquiring bibliography, for mentoring, for the assessment methods that we're going to be using. This has been just essential for getting this going. So I'm really thankful, and thank you all for listening.
Phenomenal work, Dr. Adamarola, and many congratulations. We are going to move on to Dr. Priyanka Bhandari, and I'm going to ask all my Rise WIMS grant awardees, please feel free to turn on your cameras. By default, I believe because you went from participant mode to panel mode, the cameras were turned off, so please feel free to turn your cameras on. Dr. Bhandari is an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at SIU School of Medicine. She's been here for the last 2 years, and we are excited to hear from her. Dr. Bhandari, are you ready?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Prakash, for the kind introduction. Like Dr. Prakash said, I work with the Department of Family Medicine, and today I am going to talk about my research project titled Influence of Obesity on Blood Pressure Responses to Pharmacological Therapy in Treated Hypertensives. We already had a great lecture with Dr. Hegre about the effect of obesity on peripartum cardiomyopathy. So let's go ahead and look at another angle of obesity with hypertension. My research team includes Mr. Vivek Prakash and Dr. Flax from the Department of Internal Medicine, and I'm highly grateful to both of them for their immense support and help in this project. As we all know, both obesity and hypertension are big global health problems. As per the most recent analysis by the World Health Organization in May of 2021, it's estimated that about 1.13 billion people worldwide are affected by hypertension, and around 650 million people are affected by obesity worldwide. Multiple studies have shown a positive correlate association between obesity and hypertension. People with high blood pressure have a higher chance of having a higher BMI and vice versa. However, we have also seen studies where we have seen a U-shaped relationship between BMI and the cardiovascular or all-cause mortality. And this U-shaped curve has high mortality in both ends of the U and has a flat curve down in the middle. However, we have not seen any evidence that these lean hypertensives who form one part of the U curve have had more severe or harder to treat hypertension that could account for their excess mortality. In fact, what we found was that the higher mortality in these lean hypertensives was highly or disproportionately related to the lifestyle changes, especially to increased use of alcohol and smoking. And the mortality was seen more in the higher in the earlier years of follow-up. Now, with these objectives or this background in mind, we designed our objectives where we wanted to explore whether the previously documented higher cardiovascular rates at the higher BMI could be related to the higher on-treatment blood pressure. And we also wanted to understand the intensity of the antihypertensive drug therapy, also called as TIS or treatment intensity score, required to attain the blood pressure responses in the different BMI groups. I'll define TIS, which is the percentage dose of the maximum FDA-approved daily dose of an antihypertensive. Let's say for amlodipine, the maximum approved dose is 10, so 5 would be 0.5 of the TIS. Talking about our methodology, so our study is a retrospective exploratory study. We had a de-identified group of 851 adults, predominantly African-American females from an urban referral population. To be included in the study, the patient had to have at least 2 or more than 2 follow-up visits within a minimum of 3 months period. Exclusion criteria had an age limit of more than equal to 80 years, history of heart failure, and an estimated GFR of less than equal to 25. The follow-up period was truncated at 1 year with a median follow-up of 8.8 months. Like stated earlier, we calculated the TIS scores of the antihypertensives and the adequate drug classes Now, adequate drug classes is defined as drug classes that we have used with at least half of the maximum FDA approved doses or the 0.5 of the TIS. Now, as you can see here, we had initially, when we started our analysis, we used 4 groups. We divided our cohort into 4 groups, and we have the BMI categories on the left hand of the screen. As we started analyzing our data, however, we found that our U curve, or the flat part of a U curve, was somewhere around the 30 BMI. And in order to make things simplified, what we did was we clubbed the first 2 and the second 2 groups into a BMI less than 30 and a BMI more than equal to 30. As far as the statistical analysis is concerned, for our categorical variables, which include race, gender, diabetic status, smoking status, we use chi-square test. For our continuous variables, which included age, systolic and diastolic blood pressure above goal, adequate classes, and the TIS, for the unadjusted comparison, we use the journal linear models. The adjusted end of fall-off systolic and diastolic blood pressure was modeled again on a journal linear model with baseline BMI, eGFR, age, gender, race, and the smoking status. Our primary focus was on the end of fall-off systolic and diastolic blood pressure with blood pressure targets to less than 140/90. The main contrast that we made was, as stated earlier, was between BMI less than 30 and BMI more than equal to 30, with keeping the alpha error at less than equal to 0.05 deemed as statistically significant. Now, the table 1 that's up on the screen is showing the baseline characteristics of our cohort. And if you can see on the table, we find that the higher BMI category included more of the African American female population, non-smoker. They were more non-smokers. They had a higher starting systolic blood pressure, a higher starting diastolic blood pressure, a higher above goal blood pressure, and they were already using a higher amount of adequate classes and a higher TIS score as far as the antihypertensives are concerned. Let's go to the next one. Now, the table 2 shows the follow-up of the cohort. Now, this is the unadjusted data cohort. As you can see, the final systolic blood pressure was higher in the higher BMI group. They also had a final diastolic blood pressure being higher than the lesser BMI group. And they also had a higher TIS score and a higher use of the adequate classes. So basically, all these 4 parameters were found to be statistically significant and at a higher level in the higher BMI group versus the lower BMI group. Now, in the table 3, what we are showing is that besides the TIS and the adequate classes, we also try to look at the different antihypertensive classes that were used in both the groups. We found that besides the high TIS and the adequate classes, the calcium blockers and the RAS blockers were preferentially used higher in the higher BMI group at the baseline. The RAS blockers includes ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and the direct renin inhibitors. Again, at the end of the follow-up of our study, we looked at what was the effect of what did we find at the end of follow-up in the higher BMI group. We found that the higher BMI group needed more of the aldosterone antagonists, the calcium blockers, the diuretics, and the RAS blockers as compared to the lower BMI group. And we also found an absolute increase in the usage of aldosterone antagonists and diuretics in this group versus the lower BMI group. Now, table 4 shows the regression models for the adjusted data with the significant differences between the last systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. Now, interestingly, after adjustment for all the confounders, we found that the higher BMI group still had, at the end of the follow-up, still had a higher systolic blood pressure average at 3.4 millimeters as compared to the lower BMI group. And the confidence interval range anywhere from 0.6 to 6.1 millimeters of mercury. Similarly, for the diastolic blood pressure, the higher BMI group had an absolute higher average diastolic blood pressure of 1.79, or we could say 1.8, as compared to the lower BMI group, and the confidence intervals range from 0.06 to 3.53. Both of these levels was found to be statistically significant. All right, so what did we get till now from this study? So what we found out was that there was a similar magnitude of blood pressure lowering across the BMI groups. However, the higher BMI category did have a significantly higher systolic and diastolic blood pressure even at the end of the follow-up, despite usage of a higher TIS and higher use of the adequate number of antihypertensive drugs. Now, these results are also consistent with the fact that obese hypertensives would require a greater intensity of antihypertensive therapy than their leaner counterparts to achieve similar levels of blood pressure control. We also indirectly confirmed our observation that the lean hypertensives do not have a more severe or harder to treat hypertension than their obese counterparts. In fact, what we found was that in our obese counterparts, there was difference not only in the TIS and the adequate number of antihypertensives, but they also had a different set of antihypertensives that were prescribed in their group. Like described earlier, diuretics, aldosterone antagonists, calcium channel blockers, and RAS blockers were being preferentially used at a higher BMI. And like I had told earlier, diuretics and aldosterone antagonists showed a higher usage, increased usage at the end of the follow-up. What is the clinical relevance as far as a clinician is concerned to this study? So as clinicians or as primary care physicians, we need to understand that the intensity of pharmacological treatment required to attain target blood pressure levels is going to be substantially higher in an obese hypertensive versus a lean hypertensive. Currently, unfortunately, we do not have any blood pressure guidelines who have altered the blood pressure targets or have given specific BMI-related blood pressure guidelines to follow to the clinicians. We also need to be aware that this higher end of systolic and diastolic blood pressure, if it remains maintained in these obese hypertensives over time, could be responsible for the substantially higher cardiovascular risks that are observed in this group, coming back to the U shape that I was talking to. Since this group makes the right side of the tube, that could be one of the reasons that could be attributing to their higher overall cardiovascular and overall mortality risk. So discussing about the strengths and limitations of a study, I would say the strength of a study was that it was a one-year follow-up study, and it was the patients were being treated in a hypertension specialty clinic. The limitations were, of course, that our cohort had predominantly African-American females who had, a lot of them had diabetes, they had advanced hypertension, and something which might not be seen typically in a primary care setting. And while it was a strength that they were being treated intensively by a hypertension specialist in that clinic, that might not be able to be replicated in a primary care setting. We also did not have any objective measure of adherence to the prescribed drug therapy, but at the same time, we did not have any suspicion of body size affecting the medication adherence. And finally, we did not report any clinical or mortality outcomes. All right, and thank you.
Wonderful work. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhandari. And last but certainly not least, in the last 10 minutes, we have Dr. Ruchika Goyal. Dr. Goyle is an associate professor of internal medicine and pediatrics, division of Hem/Onc at the Simmons Cancer Institute at SIU School of Medicine. She's also adjunct associate professor of pathology in the division of transfusion medicine at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Dr. Goyle, and everybody, please stick with us for this last fantastic presentation and a very special Juneteenth raffle. Dr. Goyle.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash. I wonder if one can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, trying to make this into presentation mode. Okay, all right. We do have a couple of audience questions to start with. The main topic of the presentation is to assess gender disparities in the research and what impact COVID-19 has had on the same. So I've asked for Jen's help in putting up a couple of audience response questions. So just before going into the topic, I just wanted to see at the baseline, what do our attendees think? Do you anticipate baseline disparity in the published academic research output between men and women? Okay, so almost 83% of the attendees feel that yes, there is a baseline disparity, and they think that it is both as first author and second author. Okay, all right, as first author and senior author. Next question, please. Our next question was, overall, what % proportion of women as compared to men do we anticipate being first authors on PubMed-based research? So if we were to divide it among 100% split, how many do we think will be women as first authors compared to men? Okay, can we see the answers? All right, so wow, that's revealing that so from almost 20 attendees, majority of them think that, let's try and see if I can read this right. So almost 50% think that less than 30% of the women should be first authors. Okay, let's go to the next question, please. So it's a similar question, but now we're trying to see overall what proportion of women as compared to men do we anticipate as being last or senior authors on PubMed-based research? Right, so a slightly different presentation here. About 30% of our participating folks feel that it is less than 30%. And we have about 10% who think that more women, so 60 to 80% women will be senior authors. And then 30 to 40%, about 20% of the group thinks. Okay, we have just one more quick question. And do you anticipate that COVID-19 would have disproportionately affected women researchers and their academic output? Okay, so more unanimous decisions here, where almost 2/3 of the participating vote polling members think that yes, it would have adversely affected women researchers more. So thank you so much, Jen, for doing this. So I would like to go ahead and see what does our project as part of the Rise WIMS grant actually show us as an objective assessment. I would just like to start by giving a shout out to the grant and to our research mentor, Dr. Vidya Prakash, and to our AWIMS mentor, Dr. Sue Hingle. Truly, like this grant has worked to, just as the name says, it's a research initiative. It is sponsoring, it has provided funding, as well as I think we try to take the goal where we're using the grant as an opportunity to empower all our investigators so that each of them is learning new skills and going to a different level from where they started. So thanks again. And our team is Dr. Prakash, Dr. Nupama Mirikale, who is a rising PGY3 in internal medicine, Dr. Stephanie Bittner, our lead pharmacist at the SIU Anticoagulation Clinic, Ms. Lydia Howell, our librarian from SIU Libraries, and Mr. Vivek Prakash from the Center of Clinical Research. So it's been a wonderful team, and I just wanted to give a shout out at the very beginning before we start. So just at the baseline, I think personally as a woman and as a mom, I can endorse that at a baseline, as a subjective assessment, we feel that women are at a baseline responsible for more of the household and childcare responsibilities than their male counterparts. And the COVID pandemic has further heightened this inequity, especially so for the female academic researchers, as they have been challenged by more household and childcare responsibilities in addition to the professional responsibilities. So we already have some research studies that have provided objective evidence showing the same, and these have been published in pretty high impact journals, including Nature and JAMA Surgery. I have myself had an opportunity of being part of a smaller project assessing a similar output in a blood banking realm. So as part of this, the Rise WIMS grant, we wanted to perform an objective comparison of the research outputs restricted to internal medicine. This is comparing the outputs between men and women and assess the differences between 2019 and 2020 as our study years. We chose for comparing the academic output from 5 leading internal medicine journals: JAMA, Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA Internal Medicine, and Annals of Internal Medicine. Just as a brief method, we reviewed all the publications of these 5 main internal medicine journals. The timeline that we chose was 6 months from 2019 as the baseline, using July 1st through end of December, and then the similar years timeline for 2020 using July 1st through December 2020. And the reason we chose this is that although the pandemic, we were in the thick of that through March, but we wanted to give at least 3 months of leeway period for the impact to start showing on the academic output. So we use these 6 months as the study period for baseline and comparison. We used Web of Science code collection for identification of the data. And further, we used a web-based gender determination tool to review the gender of the first and the last authors. For statistical methods, we have compared the difference in the proportion of papers with the female first or last authors between the given years using chi-square test. We used alpha of 0.05 as the threshold of significance. I am, in the interest of time, not going to go in much more detail here, but this was one of the things, just this couple slides go over details of how we went on with retrieving the citations to exporting them and actually making data into an analyzable form. It was quite a bit of work behind the scenes trying to extract the author names, the country, parsing the details, but it was a work in, something that we developed as part of the project, and each team member contributed to doing the analysis and can now use this as an independent skill if they want to apply this, for doing any PubMed search-based project in the future. And I really have to thank Lydia from SAU Library here for helping us with a lot. So just to review the results, so between the total 12 months of the study duration from 2019 and 2020, we were able to download approximately 6,300 articles, and of which we analyzed just a little over 6,000 articles after removing unidentified or unclear genders. And here you can see the breakdown by the various journals, and we see that JAMA is comprising 28% of the journal contribution of the articles. So this is our baseline results, where if we were to compare splitting the 100%, this was one of the audience questions, just at the baseline stratifying women in blue and the male counterparts in gray for 2019 as well as 2020. The first, you can see that at the baseline itself, women are very less. It's 30 to 40% women are first authors as well as senior authors. So just about 1/3. So you already identify a disparity at the baseline. And an overall number, although from a raw output, the numbers did go decrease, and it went to 35% and 34% for women as senior and first authors, but those results were not statistically significantly different. Furthermore, if we wanted to do an analysis by the journal, we saw that the highest proportion witnessed was for JAMA, where at the baseline, very surprising but encouraging results, that 54% of the researchers' output was actually women at the baseline. And the lowest was for New England Journal of Medicine at only 26%. And with this, our average came to about 35 to 38%, as we saw. And similar pattern was seen for women researchers as senior or last authors, where JAMA was highest with almost an equal distribution with 50% female and male authors, and New England Journal even a little bit more disparate with only 24% of the women researchers as senior authors. Here you can see the overall distribution by the years across the journals and highlighting, okay. So the other thing I want to highlight is JAMA was the highest, followed by Lancet, which was the second highest journal, showing most number of female researchers as showing the most academic output. Okay, so if we were to do a broad overall comparison, as I mentioned, between 2019 to 2020, for overall for female, for first authors as well as second authors, there was no significant change. Overall, the percentage was low to start with and did remain low. However, we found that the most notable decrease was that for JAMA, between the pre-COVID and the COVID-19, there was a statistically significant decrease. So notably, the journal which had the most equitable distribution at the baseline to start with had the most significant detail in the female authorship. So this graph is slightly busy, and I'm going to try to break it down. So we have the first authors here at the left and the last author analysis or senior author analysis on the right by the journals, and then this is separated by the year. So I just wanted to highlight here that you can see for JAMA between 2019 to 2020, the percentage went from 54% of first women to only 47% of women as first authors. Likewise, for senior authors, it was 50% to start, but it went to only 43%. The other journal, which also had the highest number of, the second highest number of women researchers, also saw a decrease, 40% to 35%, 33% to 31%. These numbers were too small to be clinically significant. It was only reached significance for JAMA. For the others, we don't really see any specific trends or patterns. They were minor insignificant differences. So just as a study conclusion, what we saw was that overall, only about 1/3 of the women were showing publishing as first as well as last authors at the baseline, as compared to 2/3 of the publication output being from men. And notably, JAMA, the journal which did have the highest proportion of publishing female researchers as first as well as last authors, showed the highest negative impact with COVID-19. And this was seen for first as well as last authors. So this objective assessment highlighted extent baseline disparity in the research productivity of women researchers, and that the negative impact of COVID-19 was perceived highest in journals which had the highest baseline proportion. So I just wanted to give a shout out with a couple specific grant goals that we think as a team that we have achieved, and with every member contributing, with some of our trainees developing skills in protocol writing and going through the steps of IRB approval. We learned skills in data access and mining from an online, freely and publicly available resource, and to be applied to a project successfully. The raw output that was analyzed, there was a lot of work behind the scenes in making it meaningful and analyzable. With Vivek Prakash's help, we've all learned basic skills in analysis for the team members who did not. And currently, we are in the process of writing our abstract for an American Medical Association meeting and submit the manuscript as a brief report. So once again, I want to give thanks to the team and the grant.
Fantastic work, Dr. Goyle. And I will tell you, as the quote research mentor, and I say quote because I'm actually learning more from Dr. Goyle. I feel like she's my research mentor in this, as instead of the other way around. She has been a phenomenal leader and researcher and has really brought the team along very well. So just a personal shout out to you, Dr. Goyle. You inspire me. And I am just beyond inspired by what I have seen. You know, if this was a research initiative to sponsor and empower women in medicine and science, we have met our goal. We really have. And this is just 5 of our 13 researchers who have done tremendous work, really groundbreaking. And I love that disparities have been highlighted throughout all of them. So fantastic work. And many thanks to the core principal investigator team, Dr. Susan Hingle, Dr. Hyung Han, and Dr. Wendy Elamine, who have been instrumental in moving this program forward. I promised you I would end with a raffle honoring Juneteenth. So we're going to try and make this fun. Instead of drawing randomly, the first person in the chat to say, please unmute me, to answer the following question. What is the background behind Juneteenth? What is the history behind the name Juneteenth? Whoever answers first gets the last raffle prize, Managing Your Career, from Harvard Business Review, Working Parents. So who can answer my question?
Karen Reynolds has been unmuted.
Okay, Karen, go for it.
Well, when the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect at January 1st of 1863, maybe, a lot of slaves really didn't get, particularly in the South and the Deep South, really weren't freed. And so by the time the military got their way down to Texas, they informed the people there that all the slaves were in fact free, and so that happened on June 19th, 1865.
Karen Reynolds, congratulations. You are the winner of the final raffle. And I'm going to read from the New York Times an article. On June 19th, 1865, about 2 months after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia, Gordon Granger, a Union general, arrived in Galveston, Texas to inform enslaved African Americans of their freedom and that the Civil War had ended. General Granger's announcement put into effect the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been issued more than 2.5 years earlier on January 1st, 1863, thank you, Karen, by President Abraham Lincoln. Yes, and Dr. Goyle actually wrote, besides the proclamation from President Lincoln almost 3 years earlier, so fantastic. I'm going to leave all of you with a quote that I think ties this whole program together. I hope you can see my screen. So this is by Audre Lorde, who says, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. I sincerely hope the last 2 days have made you think deeply about your role as advocates, made you realize that you don't need formal authority to lead, and you certainly don't need formal authority to advocate, that you can advocate and lead in your own spheres of influence. And so I really, really hope that you come away from this conference inspired, as I have been by our speakers and by these empowering discussions. And I hope that you will use your power that you have, recognize the power within your personal stories, within your journeys, and use that power to carry your role as invaluable allies and advocates to move that work forward. I believe in every one of you. I am so thankful for you. I am so inspired by you. And I'm so thankful to each of you for being a part of this journey with me and for being a part of this conference. Happy Juneteenth. Very, very excited that it's finally been announced as a federal holiday, and wish you a wonderful weekend and days ahead. Thank you.